10 Harleys sat bleeding rain outside a diner. No decent person would enter after midnight. Inside, men with knife scars and prison tattoos drank bourbon in silence. Men the world had already buried. They were the Iron Vultures, and they answered to one name, Graves Mercer. But tonight, the most dangerous thing that walked through that door wasn't a rival gang or a loaded gun. It was a 9-year-old girl covered in mud and bruises, carrying a dead man's secret that would crack every hardened heart in that room wide open. She whispered one name, and the entire Brotherhood stopped breathing. What she said next changed everything. If you want to feel this story down to your bones, stay until the very end. Drop a like right now, leave a comment telling me what city you're watching from, and let's ride together. Part 1. The rain had no mercy that night. Came down in sheets across the Nevada flatlands, hammering the corrugated roof of Blackline Diner like 1,000 fists demanding entry. The neon sign outside buzzed and flickered, half the letters dead, the other half bleeding pink and blue light across the wet asphalt where 10 Harley-Davidsons sat cooling in the downpour. Chrome fenders caught the fractured glow. Exhaust pipes ticked as engines surrendered their heat to the cold. Water pooled beneath heavy rubber tires and ran in black rivers toward the storm drains. Inside, the air was a living thing, thick with cigarette smoke, the smell of burned coffee, cheap bourbon, and decades of stories no one would ever print. The Iron Vultures Motorcycle Club had claimed the back half of Blackline the way wolves claim territory, not with signs, but with presence. 8 men sat scattered across cracked vinyl booths and mismatched chairs. Their leather cuts were sun-bleached and road-scarred, stitched with patches earned in blood, silence, and time. The center patch, a vulture clutching a broken chain, had faded on every vest, but no man among them had ever let its meaning fade. They didn't talk much tonight. They rarely did anymore. There was Tank, 6'4", 300 pounds, hands like engine blocks, a beard that touched his chest. He'd done 9 years in Ely State Prison for aggravated assault after a bar fight that left 2 men in the ICU and 1 with a permanent limp. He never talked about what happened inside those walls. But sometimes, late at night, his hand shook so badly he couldn't hold a wrench. He'd grip the edge of a workbench and breathe through his teeth until the tremors passed, and no one in the club ever mentioned it. Not once. Ash sat beside him, lean, sharp-jawed, quiet in a way that made people nervous. He was the club's reader, the one who kept records and handled paperwork, the one who could quote case law from memory because he'd spent years fighting his own. 3DU is a custody battle he lost so badly the judge sealed the records. A daughter somewhere in California who didn't know his face. He carried a photograph of her in his wallet. A school picture, 2nd grade, gap-toothed smile. He never showed it to anyone, but every man in the club knew it was there. Hollow sat alone at the far end of the counter, nursing black coffee. He was the oldest. 67, Vietnam veteran. 2 Purple Hearts. A voice so quiet people leaned in whenever he spoke, which wasn't often. His real name was Harold Linden, but no one had called him that in 40 years. They called him Hollow, because that's what the war left behind. A man whose eyes looked through walls, through people, through time itself. He never slept more than 3 hours. He read old Western novels until dawn, and sometimes the waitress at Blackline would find him asleep with a paperback open on his chest, his face finally still. And then there was Graves. Graves Mercer sat in the corner booth with his back against the wall, always against the wall. He was 61 years old, built like a wrecking yard, with silver hair pulled back tight and a beard streaked with iron gray. His leather cut carried more patches than anyone else's. President, founder, 27 years at the head of the table. His knuckles were permanently swollen. His left knee clicked when he walked from an old wreck on Highway 93 that should have killed him. A scar ran from his right ear to the corner of his jaw, a gift from a knife fight in Tucson, 1994. He never covered it. But the thing people noticed about Graves wasn't the scars or the size. It was his eyes. They were the color of wet cement, flat, patient, absolutely unreadable. Men who'd faced him across negotiation tables, courtrooms, and back alley confrontations all said the same thing. You couldn't tell what Graves Mercer was thinking until it was already too late. He was staring at his coffee when the bell above the diner door rang. Everyone heard it. That small, cheap brass bell that shivered every time someone pushed through the heavy glass door. It was nothing, a sound they'd heard 10,000 times. But something about it tonight cut through the smoke and the silence like a blade drawn slow across leather. Graves didn't look up immediately. He lifted his coffee, took a sip, set it down. Then he looked. A little girl stood in the doorway. She couldn't have been more than 9 years old. Thin. Too thin. The kind of thin that told you meals had been missed, not by choice. She wore a gray hoodie 3 sizes too large, the sleeves hanging past her fingertips, the hem reaching her thighs. Her sneakers were caked with mud and coming apart at the soles. Her dark hair hung in wet tangles across her face. Rain dripped from her clothes onto the linoleum floor in a steady, quiet rhythm. The only sound in a room that had suddenly gone completely still. She was shaking, not from cold, from something deeper. Every biker in that diner registered the same details simultaneously. The way cops notice exits, the way soldiers notice rooflines, the oversized sleeves, the way she held her arms close to her body, protective, guarding, the faint discoloration near her left wrist where the sleeve had ridden up just enough, the hollows beneath her eyes that no child should carry. Tank's jaw tightened. Ash set down his glass slowly. Hollow's coffee cup stopped halfway to his mouth. Graves watched her. The girl didn't hesitate. That was the thing that would haunt every man in that room for years. She didn't look around with the wide, panicked eyes of a lost child. She didn't cry. She didn't ask for help. She walked, steady, deliberate, almost mechanical, straight across the diner floor, past the counter, past the empty stools, past 8 men in leather cuts who could have terrified any grown adult. And she stopped directly in front of Graves Mercer's booth. She looked up at him. Her eyes were brown. Dark, liquid brown, and absolutely, terrifyingly calm. Then she pointed at his right forearm, where the sleeve of his flannel had been rolled to the elbow. There, inked deep into weathered skin, sat a tattoo, a raven in flight, wings spread wide, clutching a single key in its talons. The ink had blurred slightly with age, the way old tattoos do, bleeding at the edges like watercolor left in the rain. "My dad had that same tattoo," she said. Her voice didn't shake. It was small, yes, thin, but it carried a weight no child's voice should carry, the weight of someone who had already learned that the world does not come when you call. Graves set his coffee down. He didn't blink, didn't move. "Who's your dad?" he asked quietly. The girl held his gaze the way fighters hold ground, not with aggression, but with the absolute refusal to step backward. She took one breath. Then she said the name. "Phantom Vale." The effect was immediate and devastating. Tank's chair scraped back against the floor with a sound like a gunshot. Ash's hand went flat on the table, fingers spread wide. 2 men near the jukebox exchanged a look so sharp it could have drawn blood. Hollow set his coffee down with exaggerated slowness, as if the cup might shatter if he moved too fast. Phantom Vale. The name hit the room like a freight train made of ghosts. It landed on every man differently. Some felt it in the chest, some in the throat, some in the place behind the eyes where memories you've spent years burying suddenly claw back to the surface. Phantom Vale had ridden with the Iron Vultures for 6 years, late 80s to early 90s. He was fast, fearless, and unreadable. A man who rode point on every run and never once flinched at what waited at the end of the road. He could strip a carburetor in the dark, outrun anything the highway patrol put on his tail, and disappear into the desert like smoke through a chain-link fence. He earned his name because that's what he was, a phantom. Present one moment, gone the next. Real enough to touch, impossible to hold. And then 15 years ago, he vanished. No note, no call, no explanation. One night, Phantom's bay in the garage was empty, his room at the clubhouse cleared out, his phone disconnected. The club searched for 3 months. Graves personally drove 8,000 miles across 4 states chasing leads that all went dead. They checked hospitals, morgues, county lockups. Nothing. Phantom Vale was simply gone, erased from the world as cleanly as if he'd never existed. The club mourned him the way they mourned all their dead. They drank. They rode in silence. They didn't speak his name for 2 years, and slowly, painfully, they let him go. Filed him under the heaviest category a Brotherhood can carry, the ones who walked away without saying why. Some men took it as betrayal. Others took it as proof that even the strongest bonds could be broken without warning. Graves never said what he believed. He just stopped talking about Phantom entirely, and the silence around that name became a wall no one in the club dared to breach. Until now. Until this little girl, dripping rain on a diner floor, reached across 15 years of silence and said the name out loud like it belonged to her. Graves studied her face, the shape of her jaw, the set of her eyes, the way she stood, weight-balanced, shoulders square, chin up. He saw it. Every man in that room saw it. She had Phantom's face, softened by youth, blurred by a mother's features, but unmistakable. She looked like a ghost wearing a child's skin. "Sit down," Graves said. He didn't raise his voice. He never did when it mattered. He slid the coffee cup aside and gestured to the seat across from him. The girl hesitated for exactly 1 second, measuring, calculating, deciding, and then she sat. Her feet didn't reach the floor. Her hands disappeared into her sleeves. She smelled like rain and something else. Something institutional. Antiseptic. Hospital hallways. "How old are you?" Graves asked. 9. "How'd you get here?" "I walked." Ash leaned forward from the next booth. "From where?" "Millbrook Terrace." Her voice was flat, factual. "It's about 4 miles." 4 miles. In the rain, in the dark, alone, at 9 years old. Tank stood up slowly, walked to the counter, and poured a glass of water without being asked. He brought it to the booth and set it in front of her. She looked at it, looked at him, his massive frame, his scarred hands, his eyes, which at that moment held something no one in that diner had seen in years, absolute devastating gentleness. She drank the water. Graves waited until she set the glass down. He had 1,000 questions, but he asked the only one that mattered. "Where's your mother?" The calm broke. Just for a moment. A hairline fracture across that impossible composure. A flicker in her eyes, a tightening around her mouth, a tremor in her chin that lasted half a second before she wrestled it back under control. But Graves caught it. He'd spent a lifetime reading faces across card tables and confrontations, and he knew what that flicker meant. Terror. Not of what might happen, but of what was already happening. "She's sick," Ellie said. "She can't breathe right. She has a machine that helps, but last week the power got shut off for 2 days and she couldn't use it. I put blankets on her and opened the windows, but it was too cold. She turned blue. I called 911, but they took 40 minutes. She almost—" The girl stopped, swallowed. Her hands tightened into fists inside those oversized sleeves. "She's home now. But she's getting worse. And the man who owns the building says we have to leave by Friday or he'll throw our stuff in the street." Nobody spoke. Rain hammered the roof. The neon sign outside buzzed and crackled, casting pink shadows that crawled across the girl's face and then retreated, like even the light was afraid to stay too long. "Your dad," Graves said slowly. "When did he pass?" 3 years ago. Cancer." She said it the way soldiers report casualties, clean, direct, emptied of everything except the fact itself. "Before he died, he told me something. He said if things ever got really bad, worse than we could handle, I should find a diner called Blackline outside Reno and look for men with a vulture on their jackets." She looked around the room at the leather cuts, the faded patches, the hard faces watching her from the smoke. He said to find his brothers. Graves closed his eyes, just for a moment. 3 seconds, maybe 4. But in those 3 seconds, something shifted behind his face, tectonic, slow, irreversible. When he opened his eyes again, they were different. The flatness was gone. In its place was something older and infinitely more dangerous than anger. It was recognition. He recognized this. The losing, the abandonment, the system that was supposed to catch people and never did. He recognized it because he'd lived inside it, foster homes that smelled like mildew and indifference, group homes where the older kids taught you how to fight before they taught you how to read, social workers who signed forms without looking at faces. He recognized the look in this girl's eyes because he'd worn it himself 40 years ago, standing in a different doorway, asking a different room full of strangers for something he couldn't name. "Tank," Graves said quietly. "Bring the truck around." "Where are we going?" Tank asked. "Millbrook Terrace." Tank didn't ask another question. He grabbed his jacket and walked out into the rain. 30 seconds later, the deep rumble of a diesel engine shook the parking lot. Graves stood up. His knee clicked. He didn't wince. He never did in front of anyone. He looked down at the girl, and for the first time, his voice carried something beyond command. "What's your name, kid?" "Ellie. Ellie Vale." Graves nodded slowly. He reached for his jacket, heavy black leather, road-worn, scarred at the elbows and shoulders from decades of highway miles. He draped it over her shoulders. It swallowed her entirely, hanging to her knees, the sleeves pooling on the booth seat. She looked up at him from inside that leather shell like a small animal peering out of a cave. "All right, Ellie Vale," Graves said. "Show us where your mom is." They drove through rain so thick the headlights barely cut 20 feet ahead. Tank drove. Graves sat in the passenger seat. Ellie sat in the back of the crew cab, still wrapped in Graves's jacket, watching the city slide past through water-streaked windows. Behind them, 5 Harleys followed in formation, headlights cutting through the storm like a convoy moving through hostile territory. Millbrook Terrace announced itself before they arrived, not with a sign, but with a feeling. The streetlights thinned out. The buildings grew shorter, darker, more defeated. Abandoned storefronts lined the road with plywood windows and graffiti that no one bothered to clean. A liquor store on the corner had bars on every window and a security camera hanging from a broken mount, pointing at nothing. The apartment building sat at the end of a dead-end street, 3 stories. Brown bricks stained black with age and neglect. Half the windows were dark. The ones that weren't gave off the weak yellow light of bare bulbs in desperation. The front steps were cracked. The handrail was missing. A dumpster near the entrance overflowed with trash bags that had been sitting long enough to slump and sag like exhausted bodies. The rain had turned to sleet. Ellie led them up a stairwell that smelled like mildew, urine, and something chemical, bleach maybe, laid over rot that no amount of cleaning could reach. The walls were water-stained. The lights on the second-floor landing were burned out. On the 3rd floor, she stopped in front of apartment 3C and pulled a key from inside her shoe. The door opened to a 1-bedroom apartment that told the entire story without a single word. Medical bills covered the kitchen table, stacked, scattered, some opened, some still sealed. White envelopes with red final notice stamps, a disconnection warning from the power company. An eviction notice taped to the refrigerator with a strip of masking tape that had yellowed and curled at the edges. The kitchen sink held 2 days of dishes. The trash can was full. The countertop held a half-empty bottle of children's vitamins and a box of saltine crackers. The living room had been converted into a sick room. A hospital bed, rented based on the tag on the frame, sat against the wall beneath a window covered with a bedsheet instead of curtains. An oxygen concentrator hummed in the corner, its green light blinking steadily. Beside it, a portable oxygen tank stood upright like a silent sentinel. Pill bottles lined the windowsill. A plastic basin. A thermometer. A notebook filled with handwritten numbers, oxygen levels, temperatures, times, dates. And on the hospital bed, beneath a thin blanket and a heavier quilt, lay Lena Vale. She was 36 years old, but illness had aged her beyond recognition. Her cheekbones pressed against translucent skin. Her lips were dry and cracked. The oxygen cannula curved across her face, and her breathing came in shallow, measured pulls that seemed to require conscious effort. Each inhale a negotiation, each exhale a small surrender. Her hair, once dark, had thinned to wisps against the pillow. Her collarbones stood out like bridges over empty space. She was awake. Her eyes, Ellie's eyes, that same deep brown, tracked the sound of boots entering her apartment with the resigned awareness of someone who had stopped being surprised by bad news. When she saw the men in leather cuts filing through her doorway, she didn't scream. She didn't reach for a phone. She looked at Ellie, standing among them in an oversized leather jacket, and her face did something complicated. Relief and terror and confusion and exhaustion, all colliding in a single expression that lasted less than a second before she pulled it behind a mask of composure that was barely holding. "Ellie," she breathed. Who are these people? They're Dad's brothers, Ellie said simply. I found them. Lena's eyes widened. She tried to sit up. The effort cost her. You could see it in the way her arms trembled, the way her breath caught and went ragged. The oxygen concentrator's rhythm stuttered as she moved, then steadied. You walked a black line? Lena's voice was thin, threaded with something beyond concern. In this weather? Alone? Ellie, I told you. You told me to never go there. Ellie's voice was calm, unbending. But you stopped eating last Tuesday so I could have the food. I'm not stupid, Mom. I know what that means. The room went silent except for the hum of the oxygen machine and the sleet tapping against the covered window. Graves stood in the doorway of the living room, taking everything in with those flat, patient eyes. The bills. The machines. The woman who weighed 90 pounds and was still trying to protect her daughter from men who looked like they belonged in a federal mugshot. The girl who had walked 4 miles through a freezing storm because she'd calculated, correctly, that doing nothing was more dangerous than walking into a room full of outlaw bikers. He understood something in that moment. Something about Phantom that he'd spent 15 years trying to decode. Phantom hadn't run from the Brotherhood. He'd run toward something else, something that mattered more than the road, the club, the code. He'd found a woman, had a child. And when the cancer came, he'd faced it the same way he'd faced everything, alone, silent, without asking anyone to carry what he believed was his own weight. And he'd left his daughter one lifeline, one thread connecting her to the only men he trusted to keep her safe if the world collapsed around her. The world had collapsed. And here she was. Graves looked at Lena. Ma'am, he said. His voice was low, controlled, but stripped of the hardness he wore like armor. My name is Graves Mercer. I rode with your husband for 6 years. He was one of us. Lena's breathing changed. A hitch, a tremor. Her eyes glistened but didn't spill. He never told me much, she whispered. About that time. He said it was before. He said he left it behind. He did, Graves said, but he left us an instruction too. Through your daughter. He stepped into the room. His boots were quiet now. Deliberate, careful, the way a man walks in a hospital or beside a sleeping child. He looked at the medical bills on the table, the eviction notice on the fridge, the empty cabinets visible through the open kitchen door. When's the eviction? He asked. Friday, Ellie answered from behind him. Graves nodded slowly. He turned to Tank, who stood in the hallway, filling the entire frame. Call Ash. I need him here in 20 minutes with the ledger. Copy. And Tank. Yeah. Call everyone. Tank's eyebrows rose a fraction. Everyone? Every brother who can ride, every prospect, every associate who owes us a marker. Graves paused. His jaw tightened. Phantom's family is in trouble. That means we're all in trouble. Tank pulled his phone and stepped into the hallway. Within seconds, his low voice rumbled through the stairwell as calls went out across the Nevada night. Graves turned back to Lena. She was watching him with an expression he'd seen before. On the faces of people who'd been let down so many times they couldn't recognize help when it stood in front of them. I don't want charity, she said. The words came out sharp, almost angry, but underneath them was something fragile and raw. I didn't ask Ellie to go. I didn't ask for any of this. I know, Graves said. I've been handling this. Social services, the hospital, the landlord. I've been handling it. I know. I don't need... Her breath caught. The oxygen concentrator hummed louder as she pulled harder. Her hands gripped the blanket. For a moment, the mask slipped entirely, and what was underneath was so naked and desperate that every man in that apartment looked away, not from weakness, but from respect. The kind of respect you give someone who's been drowning silently and refusing to call for help because they've been taught that calling makes you weak. You don't need charity, Graves said quietly. And this isn't charity, this is a debt. She looked at him. Your husband gave this club 6 years of his life. He rode with us when riding meant bleeding. He pulled men out of wrecks. He sat with brothers in hospital rooms. He carried things for us that we couldn't carry ourselves. Graves paused. Then he disappeared, and we spent 15 years being angry at a man who was dying. That's on us, not on you, and not on your daughter. He pulled a chair from the kitchen table, the one piled with medical bills, and sat down beside her bed. His knee clicked as he lowered himself. The leather of his cut creaked. "So here's what's going to happen," he said. "We're going to figure out your medical situation. We're going to deal with this landlord, and we're going to make sure your daughter doesn't have to walk 4 miles in a sleet storm to find the help her father promised her." Lena stared at him for a long moment. The sleet had turned back to rain outside. The oxygen machine hummed. Somewhere in the hallway, Tank's voice continued making calls, low and steady like distant thunder. "Why?" Lena whispered. "You didn't even know we existed." Graves looked at Ellie, who stood in the kitchen doorway still wearing his jacket, watching the entire exchange with those ancient, unblinking eyes. "Because Phantom knew what we'd do," Graves said, "even if we didn't." Within the hour, the apartment looked different. Not physically, the bills were still there, the machine still hummed, the eviction notice still clung to the refrigerator. But the energy had shifted. Boots moved through the hallway, voices murmured. Ash arrived with a ledger and a laptop, setting up at the kitchen table, and methodically sorting through every piece of mail, every bill, every legal document. His face was unreadable as he worked, the same expression he wore when he was solving a problem that had too many variables and not enough time. Hollow appeared without anyone noticing, which was how he always appeared. One moment the hallway was empty, the next he was leaning against the wall near Ellie's bedroom door, a room barely large enough for a twin mattress and a small desk covered with school books. He looked inside, looked at the books, looked at the neatly made bed with its threadbare blanket, looked at the single photograph on the wall, a man with dark eyes and a raven tattoo, holding a baby. He said nothing, but his hand rested on the doorframe for a long time, as if he were standing guard over something sacred and unseen. It was past midnight when Ash looked up from the kitchen table with an expression that made everyone stop moving. "Graves," he said, "you need to see this." Graves walked over. Ash turned the laptop screen toward him. Financial records, medical billing, insurance correspondence. The numbers told a story that was worse than anyone expected. Lena's insurance had been canceled 18 months ago, not for non-payment, but through an administrative error that no one had bothered to correct. She'd filed 7 appeals, all denied. She'd called 53 times. Every call was logged in her notebook in careful handwriting with dates, times, and the names of representatives who promised callbacks that never came. She'd written 4 letters to the state insurance commissioner. 1 came back as undeliverable. 3 were never answered. Meanwhile, the medical bills had compounded. The hospital bed rental, the oxygen concentrator, the specialist visits she couldn't afford to continue, the medication she'd been rationing, cutting doses in half, then in thirds, then skipping days entirely. The ambulance ride from the power outage incident, $4,200. The ER visit, $11,600. The follow-up she never attended because she couldn't pay the copay she no longer had coverage for. Total outstanding medical debt, $187,000. Monthly income from disability, $1,140. Monthly rent, $950. The math didn't just fail, it was a death sentence written in spreadsheet cells. And behind all of it, hovering over every number like a vulture over carrion, was one name, Vincent Crow, the landlord, owner of Millbrook Terrace and 11 other properties across the worst neighborhoods in Reno. A man who had filed eviction proceedings against Lena 3 times in 18 months, each time extracting late fees that exceeded the rent itself. A man who had shut off the hot water in the building for 6 weeks during a maintenance dispute. A man whose property manager had personally visited Lena's apartment 4 times in the past month, always when Ellie was at school. Ash slid a printout across the table. "There's more," he said. "Crow's got a pattern. I pulled public records. 16 evictions in the last 2 years, all single mothers, all with medical situations, all forced out right before their units qualified for city housing protection under the new ordinance. He flips the units, doubles the rent, and moves in tenants who can't challenge him." Graves read the printout. His face didn't change, but his hand, the one resting on the table, closed slowly into a fist. Not in anger, in something quieter and more permanent. Decision. He looked across the apartment at Lena, who had finally fallen into a thin, restless sleep. Then at Ellie, who sat on the kitchen floor with her back against the cabinet, knees pulled to her chest, still wearing his leather jacket, fighting to keep her eyes open because she didn't trust sleep to protect her. "How long until Friday?" Graves asked. 4 days, Ash said. Graves stood up. His knee clicked. His jaw worked silently for a moment, grinding, calculating. "We're not letting this happen," he said. "Not loud, not dramatic, just a statement of fact. The same way you'd say the sun rises or engines burn fuel." "Graves," Ash said carefully. "The legal situation is complicated. Crow's got lawyers, good ones, and Lena's got no standing to—" "I didn't say anything about lawyers." The room went quiet. Tank, standing in the hallway, looked at Graves with an expression that was part question, part anticipation. Graves pulled his phone from his pocket, dialed a number, waited. Someone answered on the third ring. "It's Mercer," he said. "I need a meeting with Vincent Crow." A pause. "Tomorrow." Another pause. His eyes went flat. That cement-gray emptiness that men who knew him understood as the most dangerous sign in his entire arsenal. "Tell him it's about Millbrook Terrace. Tell him it's about a woman named Lena Vale." He listened for a moment. "I don't care what he's doing tomorrow. He'll make time." He hung up. Ellie was watching him from the kitchen floor with those old, old eyes. "Is he a bad man?" she asked quietly. "Mr. Crow?" Graves looked at her. For a moment, just a moment, something cracked behind those cement eyes. Not pity. Recognition. He saw himself in her. A child sitting on a floor asking questions that no child should have to ask about the adults who controlled their world. "Yeah, kid," he said. "He is." Ellie nodded slowly. No surprise. No fear. Just confirmation of something she already knew. "My dad used to say that bad men are only scary until someone scarier shows up." Graves almost smiled. Almost. "Your dad was a smart man." He turned to Tank and Ash. His voice dropped to the register that meant orders, not conversation. "Nobody leaves this apartment tonight. I want eyes on the building. 2 men on the front, 1 on the back. Shifts every 4 hours. He pointed at Ash. "I want everything you can find on Crow by morning. Properties, accounts, violations, lawsuits, everything. And I want to know who his lawyers are." "And then what?" Ash asked. Graves pulled his jacket from the chair, a spare he'd grabbed from the truck. He shrugged it on, zipped it halfway, checked the time. 1:47 a.m. "Then we go have a conversation with Mr. Crow about the way he treats families in his buildings." He moved toward the door, then stopped, turned back. Ellie was still watching him, still on the floor, still wrapped in his jacket. Her eyes were half closed now, exhaustion finally winning the war against vigilance. But she was fighting it, blinking hard, forcing herself to stay present, to stay awake, because in her 9 years of life she had learned one brutal lesson that no amount of comfort could unlearn overnight. The moment you stop watching is the moment everything falls apart. Graves knelt in front of her. His knee screamed. He ignored it. "Hey," he said. Quiet, just for her. "You did the right thing tonight. Walking to that diner in the storm, finding us. That took more guts than most grown men have." Ellie looked at him. Her lip trembled once, the first crack in her armor all night. "I didn't know if you'd be there," she whispered. "Dad said you would, but I didn't know." "We were there," Graves said. "What if you hadn't been?" The question hung in the air like smoke. What if? The 2 most dangerous words in the English language. What if the diner had been empty? What if the club had moved on? What if Phantom's last promise had been just another lie from a dying man trying to give his daughter something to hold on to? Graves didn't answer with words. He reached out and put his hand on the top of her head, gently, the way you'd touch something fragile and irreplaceable. His scarred, swollen knuckles resting against her damp hair. She didn't flinch. She didn't pull away. "Get some sleep, Ellie," he said. "We're not going anywhere." She looked at him for a long moment. Then slowly she nodded. She pulled his jacket tighter around her shoulders, lay down on the kitchen floor with her knees curled to her chest, and closed her eyes. She was asleep in 30 seconds, the deepest sleep she'd had in months. Graves stood up, looked at Hollow, who had appeared in the kitchen doorway without a sound. "Stay with her," Graves said. Hollow nodded once. He lowered himself to the floor, leaned his back against the cabinet, and pulled a worn paperback from his jacket pocket. He opened it to a dog-eared page, adjusted his reading glasses, and began to read in silence. A sentinel made of scars, silence, and old wars, standing guard over a 9-year-old girl sleeping in an oversized leather jacket on a cold kitchen floor. Outside, the rain finally stopped. But the silence that replaced it wasn't peace. It was the held breath before a storm, the kind of silence that settles over a landscape when something massive and irreversible is about to begin. Because 4 days from now, Vincent Crowe expected a sick woman and her daughter to be gone from his building. Bags on the curb, problem solved. Another unit cleared for profit. What he didn't know, what he couldn't possibly know, was that between now and Friday, 10 men on Harley-Davidsons were going to rewrite every calculation he'd ever made about power, fear, and who in this city was truly untouchable. And the first thing Vincent Crowe would learn is that the most dangerous man in any room isn't the one with the most money or the best lawyers. It's the one who has nothing left to lose, and someone worth protecting. Graves didn't sleep that night. He sat in the cab of Tank's truck outside Millbrook Terrace, with the engine off and the windows cracked, letting the cold air cut through the stale heat inside. His phone lay on the dashboard, screen dark. A cigarette burned between his fingers. His fourth since midnight, maybe his fifth. He'd lost count. The sleet had stopped, but the wind hadn't. It came off the desert in long, low gusts that rocked the truck on its suspension and made the broken streetlight at the end of the block swing back and forth, throwing shadows across the wet pavement like a pendulum measuring out the hours until something terrible happened. He was thinking about Phantom. Not the myth. Not the name whispered around clubhouse tables for 15 years. He was thinking about the man. The real one. The one who sat beside him on a roadside outside Elko in 1991, bleeding from a gash above his eye, laughing about nothing while they waited for the tow truck. The one who could roll a cigarette with one hand while doing 70 on the interstate. The one who never once talked about where he came from, what he'd lost, or what kept him awake at 3 a.m. when Graves would pass his door and see the light still on beneath it. Phantom had been a vault, sealed, airtight. You could ride beside a man for 6 years, share meals, share roads, share silences that lasted 100 miles, and still know absolutely nothing about the architecture of his pain. Graves had respected that. He'd never pushed. The club didn't work that way. You earned your seat at the table, you carried your weight, and whatever you kept locked inside your chest was your own business until the day you decided otherwise. But Phantom never decided otherwise. He just left. And now Graves sat outside a collapsing apartment building in the worst part of Reno, staring at the third-floor window where a dying woman and a 9-year-old girl were sleeping. And the only thing he felt was a fury so deep and so quiet, it scared him. Not at Phantom. At himself. Because he should have looked harder, should have pushed past the anger and the pride and spent another year, another 5 years, turning over every stone until he found the truth. Instead, he'd done what the club always did with things that hurt. He'd buried it, poured silence over the wound like concrete and called it strength. And while he was busy being strong, Phantom was dying in a rented apartment with no insurance, no brothers, no one to hold the line when the world came collecting. Graves crushed his cigarette on the edge of the window frame and flicked it into the dark. At 6:14 a.m., his phone rang. "It's Ash." The voice was thin, clipped, Ash's way of saying he'd been awake all night. "I've got the full picture on Crowe. You're not going to like it. I already don't like it. It's worse than that. Meet me at the clubhouse. Bring Tank." The Iron Vulture's clubhouse sat 17 miles outside Reno on a stretch of desert road that didn't appear on most GPS maps. It was a converted auto garage, cinder block walls, corrugated steel roof, a fenced yard filled with motorcycle frames, engine parts, and the skeletal remains of machines that had been stripped for salvage over decades. The front door was reinforced steel, painted flat black. No sign, no markings. If you didn't already know what it was, you had no business being there. Inside, the main room smelled the way it always smelled: motor oil, old leather, stale coffee, and the ghost of 10,000 cigarettes. A long wooden table dominated the center, scarred with cigarette burns, knife marks, and the ring stains of 1,000 bottles. Framed photographs lined the walls, group shots of men on motorcycles spanning decades. Some faces repeated, most didn't. The ones who were gone outnumbered the ones who remained. That was the math of a brotherhood that measured time in funerals. Ash was already at the table when Graves walked in with Tank. He had papers spread across the surface, printouts, property records, court filings, screenshots from county databases. His laptop was open, its screen casting blue light across his sharp features. A half-eaten gas station sandwich sat beside a cold coffee. His eyes were bloodshot. "Close the door," Ash said. Tank pulled the heavy steel door shut. The sound echoed through the room like the lid of a coffin. Ash didn't start with Crow. He started with something else entirely, and the way he said it, careful, measured, like a man placing a live grenade on the table, told Graves that the night was about to get worse. "I dug into Phantom's records," Ash said. "Everything I could find. Medical files, employment history, tax returns, the works." He paused, tapped a printout. "Graves, Phantom didn't just leave the club. He was running from something." "Running from what?" Ash slid a document across the table. It was a copy of a police report from Carson City, dated 3 months before Phantom disappeared. Graves picked it up, read it, read it again. His jaw tightened so hard the tendons in his neck stood out like cables. "He was a witness," Ash said. "Federal investigation. Money laundering through motorcycle parts distributors across northern Nevada. The feds had been building a case for 2 years. They got to Phantom through a parts supplier he'd been using, a guy named Devlin March. March was dirty, moving cash for someone bigger. The feds flipped March and used him to map the network, and Phantom's name came up because he'd been buying parts through March's shop for the club." Tank shifted his weight. His boots creaked against the concrete floor. "Phantom was never dirty," he said. "Not defensive, declarative, a fact he'd carry to his grave." "He wasn't," Ash confirmed. "But the feds didn't care. They wanted leverage. They wanted him to testify about the transactions, the contacts, the supply chain. And Phantom, Ash stopped, rubbed his eyes. Phantom refused. He wouldn't testify against anyone connected to the club, even indirectly. So the feds gave him a choice: cooperate, or they'd start pulling threads that would lead straight back to us, to the clubhouse, to every run, every deal, every gray area we'd ever operated in. The silence in the room was absolute, not empty, pressurized, the kind of silence that precedes detonation. "He left to protect us," Graves said. Not a question. "He disappeared himself, cut every connection, new name, new city, new life. Took Lena, they were already together, she was already pregnant, and vanished. The feds lost their leverage, the case against March eventually collapsed, and everybody moved on." Ash paused. "Everybody except Phantom. He spent the next 15 years living under a false identity, working mechanic jobs under the table, paying for Lena's medical care out of pocket because he couldn't use insurance tied to his real name without the feds potentially flagging it." Graves stood very still. His hands rested flat on the table. His eyes were focused on the middle distance, that place where rage and grief and understanding all converge into something that has no name and no outlet. "He didn't abandon us," Tank said quietly. His voice cracked on the last word. "Just barely. Just enough." "No," Ash said. "He sacrificed everything to make sure no one ever came knocking on this door." For a long time, no one spoke. The wind outside pushed against the corrugated walls with a low moan. Somewhere in the yard, a loose chain clinked against a motorcycle frame. Graves pulled a chair out from the table and sat down slowly. His hands were shaking. He pressed them flat against his thighs, hard until they stopped. When he looked up, his eyes had changed again. The cement gray was gone. What replaced it was something older, rawer, and far more dangerous. "Tell me about Crow." Ash pulled the Crow file to the center of the table. "Vincent Crow, 54. Born in Sacramento, moved to Reno in 2009, owns 14 rental properties through a network of LLCs, shell companies designed to shield him from liability. His buildings are concentrated in low-income neighborhoods, mostly targeting tenants on disability, fixed income, or government assistance. People who can't fight back. The pattern I told you about last night. It's systematic. He lets buildings deteriorate until tenants complain. Then he files eviction proceedings for minor lease violations, late payments, noise complaints, unauthorized guests. His lawyers flood tenants with paperwork they can't afford to contest. Most leave voluntarily. The ones who don't get dragged through small claims court until they're financially broken. But here's the piece that changes everything. Ash pulled up a screenshot on his laptop. Crow's got a silent partner, a real estate investment group called Ridgeline Capital. They've been buying distressed properties in Reno's East Corridor for the past 3 years, exactly the neighborhoods where Crow operates. The plan is a major commercial redevelopment, new retail, new housing, new everything. And every tenant Crow pushes out is another property that flips into Ridgeline's portfolio. How much are we talking? Tank asked. The development contract is worth $47 million. The number landed on the table like a stone. Crow's not a slumlord, Graves said slowly. He's a clearance crew. Exactly. He's the guy who does the dirty work, pushes the tenants out, lets the buildings rot, drives down property values so Ridgeline can buy everything at pennies on the dollar. And in return, Crow gets a cut of the development profits plus equity in the new properties. Graves absorbed this in silence. His fingers drummed once on the table, a single percussion, sharp and decisive. Who runs Ridgeline? That's where it gets complicated, Ash said. Ridgeline is registered in Delaware. The listed principals are lawyers, proxies. I can't trace the actual ownership without access to documents I don't have. Then get access. Graves, I'm talking about sealed corporate filings, bank records, partnership agreements. This isn't something I can pull from public databases. Then find another way. Ash looked at him. There was a question in his eyes, the kind of question you don't ask out loud because the answer might require you to cross a line you can't uncross. I know someone, Ash said carefully. A forensic accountant. Used to work for the state attorney general's office before she got pushed out for being too aggressive with developer corruption cases. She's private now. She's expensive. And she doesn't like bikers. Set the meeting. Graves? Set it. The room fell quiet again. Tank leaned against the wall with his arms crossed, his massive frame casting a shadow that covered half the table. He hadn't spoken in several minutes, but his face was working, jaw tight, brow furrowed, eyes moving between Graves and Ash with the focused intensity of a man running calculations he didn't like. There's something else, Tank said. Graves looked at him. Spoke to Deacon this morning? Deacon was the club's sergeant-at-arms, a wiry, tattooed ex-Marine who handled security and, when necessary, the kind of conversations that didn't happen at the main table. He's not on board with this. With what specifically? Any of it. The girl, the mother, the landlord. He says Phantom made his choice 15 years ago, and we don't owe his family anything. He says getting involved with Crow is picking a fight with money we can't match, and lawyers we can't beat. And he says... Tank paused. His jaw worked. He says you're letting guilt make decisions that should be made by the table. The words landed like a slap. Not because they were cruel, but because they weren't entirely wrong, and every man in that room knew it. Graves didn't flinch. He didn't raise his voice. He tilted his head slightly, a gesture so small it was almost invisible, but one that Tank and Ash both recognized as the moment before Graves either made a decision or ended a conversation. Who else agrees with Deacon? Graves asked. Tank exhaled through his nose. Mace. Probably Sutton. Maybe 1 or 2 of the prospects. That's 3 out of 12. 3 is enough to split a vote at the table. Then we won't vote. Ash looked up sharply. Graves, the bylaws. I know the bylaws. I wrote them. Graves stood up. His chair scraped back against the concrete. This isn't club business. This is personal. It's my call. My resources, my risk. Anyone who wants to ride with me rides. Anyone who doesn't stays home. No votes, no debates, no table. That's not how That's exactly how. Phantom was my brother before he was the club's. I brought him in. I rode with him. I missed every sign that he was in trouble because I was too busy running this organization to see what was right in front of me. That's my failure. And I'll fix it my way. The words hung in the cold air of the clubhouse like exhaled smoke. Tank stared at Graves. Ash stared at his laptop screen. Nobody moved. Then a voice came from the hallway. "That's a real pretty speech." Deacon stepped out of the shadows near the back entrance, a lean, angular man with close-cropped hair and tattoos running up both sides of his neck. His eyes were pale green, almost translucent, and they carried the flat, assessing quality of someone who'd spent years evaluating threats in combat zones where hesitation meant death. He wore his cut over a black thermal shirt, and his hands hung loose at his sides, relaxed but ready. Always ready. "How long you been standing there?" Graves asked. No surprise in his voice. No alarm. "Long enough." Deacon walked to the table. He didn't sit down. He stood at the opposite end from Graves, and the distance between them suddenly felt like a border. "I heard the part about Phantom, the witness protection angle, the federal case." He paused. "Touching story. It's not a story, it's a fact. It's a fact that changes nothing. Phantom left. He didn't tell us. He let us believe he was dead, or worse, that he'd betrayed us. 15 years, Graves. 15 years of every man in this club carrying that weight. And now we're supposed to, what? Adopt his kid? Fight his landlord? Burn down our bylaws because you feel guilty? I didn't say burn down anything. You said no vote. That is burning it down. The table is the table. It's the only thing that separates us from every other crew that imploded because one man thought his feelings outranked the Brotherhood." The air between them crackled. Tank shifted his weight, not toward either man, just a redistribution, like a building settling before an earthquake. Ash closed his laptop slowly. He knew what was happening. He'd seen it before. Not often, but enough. The moment when the club's structure, built on years of trust and protocol, meets the raw, ungovernable force of a president who's made a decision that lives deeper than policy. It was the fault line that every motorcycle club carries in its foundation, the tension between the institution and the man who leads it. "Deacon," Graves said. His voice had dropped. Not louder, quieter. The dangerous register. "I hear you, I respect the point, but I'm going to tell you something, and you're going to listen to every word before you respond." Deacon's jaw tightened, but he didn't move. "I've run this club for 27 years. I've made decisions that kept us alive when we should have been dead. I've buried 7 brothers. I've sat in rooms with men who wanted to kill me and walked out standing. I've earned the right to make a call outside the table when the table can't see what I see." He paused. "And what I see is a 9-year-old girl who walked 4 miles in a storm because her dying mother couldn't feed her, and her dead father trusted us enough to send her our way. That's not sentiment, that's a debt. And if you can't see the difference, then maybe you've been sitting at this table too long." Deacon's face didn't change. His eyes didn't waver. For 10 seconds, an eternity in a room full of men who communicated in fractions of expressions, he and Graves held each other's gaze across the length of that scarred wooden table. Then Deacon spoke. "I see the girl. I see the mother. I see the debt." His voice was low, controlled, stripped of everything except precision. "What I also see is a president who's about to drag this club into a war with a real estate developer backed by $47 million in investment capital, and he's doing it without a plan, without a vote, and without considering what happens to every other brother in this room when the blowback hits. I have a plan. No, you have a feeling. A plan has steps. A plan has contingencies. A plan accounts for what happens when Vincent Crow's lawyers file injunctions, harassment charges, and restraining orders against every name on our charter. A plan considers the fact that half of us are on parole, Graves. Half of us. 1 arrest, 1, and men go back inside. Men with families. Men with their own kids." The words landed. Graves felt them. Every man in that room felt them. Because Deacon wasn't wrong. The math was brutal and simple. Tank had 3 years left on his parole. Mace had 2. Sutton was on probation for a DUI that he'd barely plea bargained down from vehicular endangerment. Even Ash, with his clean record, had a custody hearing in 4 months that any criminal association could destroy. The club wasn't a gang, it wasn't a criminal enterprise. but it existed in the gray space between the legal and the outlaw, and that gray space had edges sharp enough to cut every man in it if they stepped wrong. Graves looked at Deacon for a long time. Then he looked at Tank, at Ash, at the photographs on the wall, the faces of men who'd ridden and bled and died wearing the same patch. "You're right," he said. Deacon blinked, barely. But it was there, surprise, quickly buried. "You're right that I need a plan. You're right that I can't ask men on parole to risk their freedom without knowing the full picture." Graves walked slowly around the table, not toward Deacon, along the side, past the photographs, past the years. "But you're wrong about one thing." He stopped, turned. "This isn't about guilt, and it isn't about feelings. Phantom gave up everything, his name, his brothers, his life, so the feds couldn't touch us. He died broke and alone so we could keep riding. And his daughter walked into our diner because he believed, after everything, that we were still the kind of men who show up." His voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "If we turn her away, Deacon, then Phantom died for nothing, and everything we've told ourselves about Brotherhood for 30 years is just noise." The clubhouse was silent. The wind moaned against the walls. The loose chain in the yard clinked. Deacon looked at the floor, not in defeat, in thought. His jaw worked. His fingers flexed once, then relaxed. 72 hours, Deacon said finally. Graves tilted his head. "You get 72 hours to put a real plan on this table. Steps, contingencies, legal exposure assessment for every brother. If it holds up, I'll back you. If it doesn't..." He met Graves's eyes. "It goes to a vote. Full table. Majority rules. And you accept the outcome, whatever it is." It was a compromise. It was also a challenge, and both men knew it. Graves extended his hand. Deacon looked at it for 2 full seconds before he reached across the table and took it. The handshake was brief, hard, and held exactly long enough to seal something that was equal parts agreement and warning. Deacon released first. He turned, walked to the back entrance, and disappeared into the gray morning light without another word. Tank exhaled, loud, like he'd been holding his breath for 5 minutes. "Well," he said, "that went better than I expected." Graves didn't respond. He was looking at the wall, at a photograph near the corner that most people in the club had stopped noticing years ago. It was faded, sun-bleached, the edges curling away from the frame. 5 men on motorcycles parked in a line on a desert highway. Graves, 20 years younger, stood on the far left. And beside him, shoulder to shoulder, squinting against the sun, a cigarette hanging from his lip, was Phantom Vale. Graves stared at the photograph for a long time. "Ash," he said without turning around, "get me that accountant. Today." "And the meeting with Crow?" "Still on." Graves checked his watch. 3 o'clock, his office. "Who's going?" "Me. Tank. Hollow." "Not Deacon?" "Not Deacon. Not yet." Graves turned from the photograph. His face was composed, locked down, sealed tight, the cement back in his eyes. "First we talk. We put cash on the table. We give Crow a chance to do the right thing." "And if he doesn't?" Graves didn't answer. He pulled his jacket from the chair, shrugged it on, and walked toward the door. His boots echoed across the concrete, heavy, measured, deliberate, the sound of a man who knew exactly where he was going and exactly what it might cost him. At the door he stopped, didn't turn around. "Ash." "Yeah." The name Phantom was living under. The false identity. What was it? Ash checked his notes. James Hale. He'd been using it since 2008. Graves nodded slowly. "James Hale," he repeated as if tasting the words. 15 years, new name, new life, and he still told his daughter to find us. He pushed the door open. Cold desert air flooded the room. "That's not guilt talking, Ash. That's a dead man who knew exactly who his brothers were." He stepped outside into the pale morning light, where the Harleys sat in a row along the gravel lot. Chrome dulled by rain, leather seats beaded with moisture, engines cold and waiting. 72 hours. That was the deal. 72 hours to build a plan that could protect Lena and Ellie without destroying the club. 72 hours before Deacon called for a vote that could fracture a brotherhood already cracking under the weight of a secret that had been buried for 15 years. But before any of that, there was Vincent Crow. 3 o'clock came like a verdict. Crow's office occupied the second floor of a converted warehouse on the east side of Reno, a neighborhood in transition, which was a polite way of saying a neighborhood where old buildings were being hollowed out and filled with the kind of money that didn't care who used to live there. The building's exterior was unremarkable: beige stucco, tinted windows, a small brass nameplate that read Crow Properties, LLC in letters designed to look modest while managing 14 buildings, and a pipeline to $47 million. 3 Harleys pulled into the parking lot at 2:57 p.m. Graves, Tank, Hollow. They parked in a row near the entrance, not blocking anything, not hidden, just present, visible. 3 machines radiating the particular authority that 1,000 pounds of chrome and steel commands without saying a word. They walked in together. Graves in front, Tank to his right, half a step behind. Hollow to his left, silent as a shadow, his pale eyes scanning the lobby with the automatic comprehensive sweep of a man who'd cleared buildings in jungle heat 50 years ago and never lost the habit. The receptionist, a woman in her 30s with careful makeup and a practiced smile, looked up from her desk and the smile evaporated. She saw the cuts, the patches, the scars, the size. 3 men who didn't belong in a real estate office the way a wolf doesn't belong in a petting zoo. "Can I help you?" she asked. Professional, controlled. But her hand drifted toward the phone. "Graves Mercer," Graves said. "We have a meeting with Mr. Crow." She checked her screen. Whatever she found there didn't make her feel better, but she picked up the phone, murmured something, and set it down. Second floor, end of the hall. They took the stairs. Boots echoed in the stairwell, 3 sets, slightly offset, creating a rhythm that sounded less like footsteps and more like a slow, steady drum roll. At the top, a hallway stretched toward a single door with a frosted glass panel. Through it, a shape moved, a man standing, then sitting, then standing again. Nervous. Graves opened the door without knocking. Vincent Crow's office was designed to intimidate. Mahogany desk, leather chairs, framed photographs of completed development projects covering every wall, a view of the east corridor through floor-to-ceiling windows, the very neighborhood he was systematically emptying. On the desk, a laptop, a phone, a crystal paperweight shaped like a building, and a cup of coffee that was still steaming. Crow himself stood behind the desk. He was shorter than expected, 5'8", maybe 5'9", with a thick build running to softness. Thinning hair combed carefully over a scalp that caught the overhead light. A navy suit, no tie, gold watch. His face was round, smooth, carefully maintained, the face of a man who had never been hit and had built his entire life around making sure he never would be. But his eyes were sharp, small, quick, calculating. They moved from Graves to Tank to Hollow with the rapid assessment of a man accustomed to measuring threats in terms of liability rather than violence. "Mr. Mercer," Crow said. His voice was smooth, practiced, pitched to convey control. "Please, sit down." Graves didn't sit, neither did Tank. Hollow leaned against the wall by the door, not blocking it, but making its dimensions suddenly relevant. "I'll stand," Graves said. "This won't take long." Crow's smile tightened. He gestured to the chairs anyway, then sat down himself when nobody moved. The power dynamic he'd choreographed, the big desk, the tall chair, the guest seated lower, collapsed when 3 men in leather cuts stood over him like a tribunal. "You manage Millbrook Terrace," Graves said. Not a question. "I own Millbrook Terrace," Crow corrected, "along with several other properties in the area. You've got an eviction filed against a tenant named Lena Vale, Unit 3C. Crow leaned back. His chair creaked. His fingers found the crystal paperweight and rested on it, a casual gesture that was anything but casual. "Mr. Mercer, tenant matters are confidential. I'm not in a position to discuss specific—" "She's dying," Graves said. "Chronic pulmonary disease. Can't work. Her insurance was canceled 18 months ago through an administrative error. She's got a 9-year-old daughter who's been feeding herself crackers while her mother skips meals." Crow's expression didn't change. That was the thing that made Tank's hands close into fists at his sides. Not anger on Crow's face, not defensiveness, not even denial. Nothing. a blank, polished surface that reflected everything and absorbed nothing. "I'm sorry to hear about her medical situation," Crow said, "but business is business. Ms. Vale is 8 months behind on rent. My accountants have made multiple attempts to arrange payment plans. She's been unresponsive. She's been on a ventilator. That's unfortunate, but it doesn't change the financial reality. I have obligations to my investors, my maintenance costs, my—" Graves reached into his jacket. Crow flinched, a small reflexive movement that he covered immediately by adjusting his collar, but everyone in the room saw it. What Graves produced was an envelope, plain white, thick. He placed it on Crow's desk and slid it forward. "That's $12,800, Graves said. "Cash. Covers her back rent, late fees, and 2 months forward." Crow looked at the envelope. He didn't touch it. "The eviction filing has already been processed," he said. "Unprocess it." "It's not that simple. There are legal—" "Make it that simple." Silence. The room contracted. Tank shifted his weight, and the floorboards groaned beneath him. Hollow remained motionless against the wall, his pale eyes fixed on Crow, with an expression that wasn't hostile. It was worse. It was patient. The patience of a man who had seen exactly how small a human being could become when the architecture of their power was stripped away. Crow studied Graves, studied the envelope, studied the exits. "Who are you to her?" he asked carefully. "Family." "She has no family listed on her lease application." "She does now." Crow's fingers drummed on the paperweight. Once, twice. Then he picked up his phone and held it, not dialing, just holding, the way a man holds a weapon he doesn't intend to fire yet. "Mr. Mercer, I appreciate you coming in, and I appreciate your concern for Ms. Vale, but I'm not going to accept a cash payment from an unrelated third party to settle a matter that's already in legal proceedings." He set the phone down. "If Ms. Vale wants to contest the eviction, she's welcome to appear in court with legal representation. Otherwise, the notice stands." He smiled, tight, professional, absolutely impenetrable. The smile of a man who knew that the law was on his side, the money was on his side, and 3 men in leather cuts, no matter how large or how scarred, couldn't change the mathematical certainty of a system designed to crush people exactly like Lena Vale. Graves looked at the envelope on the desk, then at Crow. Then at the photographs on the wall, the gleaming developments, the renovated buildings, the architectural renderings of a future built on the evictions of people who couldn't fight back. He picked up the envelope, slowly, put it back in his jacket. "That was me asking nicely," Graves said. His voice was quiet, almost gentle. The voice of a man closing a door that would never open again. He turned and walked out. Tank followed. Hollow peeled himself off the wall with the fluid silence of smoke rising from a dead fire, and the last thing Crow saw before his office door closed was those pale eyes, steady, ancient, measuring him for something he couldn't name and didn't want to understand. They didn't speak in the stairwell. They didn't speak in the parking lot. They mounted their Harleys, kicked the engines to life, 3 simultaneous roars that shattered the quiet of the parking lot and rattled the tinted windows of Crow's building, and rode out in formation. They were 2 blocks away when Tank's voice came through the Bluetooth intercom. "He's not going to fold." "No," Graves said. "So what now?" Graves didn't answer immediately. The road unfurled beneath them, cracked asphalt wet with the residue of last night's storm. The sky was low and gray, pressing down on the city like a lid. The wind cut through his jacket at 60 miles an hour, and for a moment, just a moment, he felt every one of his 61 years in his bones. "Now we stop asking," he said. Hollow's voice came through the intercom. Rare, unexpected. A voice that most members of the club heard maybe twice a year. "Graves." "Yeah." "The man's not just a landlord. I watched his eyes when you put the money down. He wasn't nervous. He was amused." "I noticed. Men like that don't get amused by men like us, unless they've got protection we haven't seen yet." A pause. Long. Waited. "We need to find out who's standing behind him before we take another step." Graves absorbed this in silence. The road turned. The city fell away. The desert opened up, vast, indifferent, ancient. "Ash is working on it," he said. "Ash is working on Ridgeline Capital. I'm talking about something closer, something personal. Hollow's voice was measured, precise. When you said Phantom's name in that office, Crow's hand moved, not to the phone, to the paperweight. He was anchoring himself. That's a recognition response. Combat veterans do it. Men under interrogation do it. Graves's hands tightened on the handlebars. The realization hit him like a cold wind. He already knew the name. He already knew the name, Hollow confirmed. The engines roared across the empty highway, 3 machines cutting through cold air toward a truth that was about to change everything. Because if Vincent Crow already knew who Phantom Vale was, already knew about the dead man whose daughter slept in his building, then this was never just a landlord squeezing a vulnerable tenant. This was something else entirely. And whatever it was, it had been waiting for them long before a 9-year-old girl walked into Black Line Diner and said a dead man's name. The clubhouse was dark when they got back. Not the usual dark. The comfortable, oil-stained dimness of a building that had sheltered men for decades. This was different. The overhead lights in the main room were off. The only illumination came from Ash's laptop screen, casting his face in cold blue light, and from the single bare bulb above the back hallway that swung slightly in the draft from the cracked window nobody had ever fixed. Shadows pooled in the corners like standing water. Ash was waiting at the table. He wasn't alone. A woman sat across from him. Mid-40s, maybe older, hard to tell. Short auburn hair shot through with gray, no makeup, wire-rimmed glasses that she wore low on her nose. She had a leather messenger bag open on the table beside a stack of file folders thick enough to stop a bullet. Her posture was rigid, contained, the posture of someone who spent their career in rooms full of men who didn't want her there and had learned to take up space without apology. "Graves," Ash said as the 3 bikers walked in. "This is Rachel Dunn, the forensic accountant I mentioned." Rachel Dunn looked up from her files. Her eyes moved from Graves to Tank to Hollow, measuring, categorizing, filing. The same systematic sweep a predator uses, except her weapon wasn't violence. It was information. "Ms. Dunn," Graves said. "Mr. Mercer." Her voice was dry, clipped, stripped of anything resembling warmth. "Your associate gave me a very interesting set of documents this morning. I've spent the last 4 hours pulling threads. I need to tell you what I found, and you're not going to like any of it." "Haven't liked anything in the last 48 hours. Go ahead." Rachel opened the first folder. Inside were corporate filings, bank records, transaction histories, pages covered in numbers and legal language dense enough to make a lawyer squint. "Ridgeline Capital," she began, "the investment group behind Crow's redevelopment scheme. I told your associate I couldn't trace the actual ownership through public records. That was true, but I didn't need public records." She pulled a single sheet from the folder and placed it flat on the table. "I have a contact at a title insurance company that processes Ridgeline's property transfers. She owed me a favor, a big one." The sheet was a partnership agreement, a signature page. 3 names at the bottom, witnessed and notarized. Graves read the first 2 names. They meant nothing. Lawyers, probably. Corporate proxies. Ghosts made of letterhead and filing fees. Then he read the 3rd name, and the room tilted. Devlin March. The name hit him like a fist to the sternum. He read it again, a 3rd time. The letters didn't change. "Ash," he said. His voice was flat, dangerously flat. "Tell me this isn't the same Devlin March." Ash's face was ashen. He'd already seen it. He'd been sitting with it for hours, and the weight of it was visible in the hollows beneath his eyes, and the way his hands lay too still on the table, as if moving them might cause something to shatter. "It's the same Devlin March," Ash said. "The parts supplier. The one the feds flipped 20 years ago to build their case. The one who dragged Phantom into the federal investigation and forced him to disappear." Rachel Dunn watched the bikers process this with the detached focus of a surgeon watching vital signs. She wasn't here for emotions. She was here for facts, and the facts were about to get worse. "March served 3 years on a reduced sentence for his cooperation with the federal investigation," she said. "Got out in 2011. Disappeared from Nevada for a while, popped up in Arizona, then Oregon, running small-time auto salvage operations. Nothing notable. Then in 2019, he resurfaces in Reno. New name, he's going by David Kellner now. New business registration. He partners with two investment attorneys to form Ridgeline Capital. Seed money comes from a trust he set up during his time in Oregon, funded by, and this is the part that matters, profits from a chain of salvage yards that were operating as fronts for the same money laundering network the feds dismantled 20 years ago. He rebuilt it, Tank said. The words came out low, almost subsonic, the verbal equivalent of tectonic plates shifting. He rebuilt it cleaner, Rachel corrected. Legitimate shell companies, real estate instead of auto parts. The cash flows through property acquisitions, renovation contracts, and tenant displacement schemes that generate enough paperwork to bury the underlying transactions. Crow is his operational arm, handles the street-level work, pushes tenants out, prepares properties for flip. March sits at the top, invisible, collecting returns on investments that started as laundered money 20 years ago. Graves hadn't moved. He stood at the head of the table with his hands flat on the scarred wood, weight forward, shoulders locked. His breathing was controlled, in through the nose, out through the mouth, the way a man breathes when his body wants to explode and his mind refuses permission. "There's more," Rachel said. She didn't ask if he wanted to hear it. She could tell by the architecture of his silence that stopping now would be worse than continuing. She pulled a second folder. Thinner. Inside was a series of property records and a printed map of Reno's East Corridor with certain addresses circled in red ink. Millbrook Terrace, Lena Vale's building. Crow acquired it in 2021 through one of his LLCs. Standard purchase, distressed property, below market value, cash deal. But the acquisition timing is unusual. Every other property Crow purchased for Ridgeline was clustered in a specific 4-block radius targeted for redevelopment. Millbrook Terrace is 6 blocks outside that radius. It doesn't fit the development footprint. There's no commercial value in the location. No reason for Crow, or March, to want it. She let the implication settle. Unless the building wasn't the target, Graves said. Unless the tenant was. The silence that followed was the worst kind. The kind that isn't empty, but full. Full of connections forming in the dark. Full of a pattern emerging from 15 years of scattered pieces that were suddenly arranging themselves into something coherent and monstrous. March knew Phantom was living there, Ash said. His voice was barely audible. Under the name James Hale. March tracked him. "I can't prove that definitively," Rachel said, "but the circumstantial evidence is compelling. March resurfaces in Reno in 2019. Phantom, James Hale, has been living in Reno since 2008. Millbrook Terrace is a building with no strategic value to Ridgeline's portfolio. Crow acquires it anyway in 2021. Phantom dies of cancer in 2022. And within 6 months of his death, Crow begins eviction proceedings against his widow." She closed the folder, removed her glasses, rubbed the bridge of her nose. The question isn't whether March knew Phantom was there. The question is what he wanted from him, and whether Phantom's death was the end of it, or just the beginning. Graves pushed himself upright from the table, slowly, like a man standing up from a wreck, checking for broken bones, testing what still worked. He turned away from the group and walked 3 steps toward the wall of photographs. His back was to them. His hands hung at his sides. His fingers opened and closed, open, closed, open, closed. A rhythm that Tank recognized from years of watching Graves process the kind of rage that couldn't be expressed without consequences. "He never stopped hunting him," Graves said to the wall. His voice was someone else's, someone stripped down to the wiring, all insulation burned away. March spent 20 years rebuilding his operation, and somewhere in those 20 years he found Phantom. He knew where he lived, he knew he was sick, and he waited. "Waited for what?" Tank asked. Graves turned around. His face was carved from something harder than bone. For him to die. So he could go after the family without anyone standing in the way. The weight of it crushed the room. Not physically, but you could feel it in the way men shifted. The way eyes dropped to the table and then forced themselves back up. Phantom hadn't just run from a federal case. He'd run from Devlin March. And March had followed him across 20 years, across state lines, across false names and buried identities. Followed him with the patience of a predator who measures time in decades instead of days. And now Phantom was dead. And the only things standing between March and whatever he wanted were a dying woman, a 9-year-old girl, and a motorcycle club that didn't even know the war had started. "What does March want?" Hollow asked. He'd been silent through the entire briefing, leaning against the wall near the door, his pale eyes moving between Rachel's files and Graves's face, with the patient focus of a man who understood that the most important information in any room was rarely spoken aloud. "This isn't about rent money. This isn't about one apartment in a building that doesn't fit his portfolio. What does March want from Phantom's family?" Rachel hesitated. It was the first time she'd shown anything other than clinical detachment, and it was the hesitation that scared everyone, because a woman who dealt in financial crimes and developer corruption for a living didn't hesitate unless the answer was genuinely terrible. "I don't have proof," she said carefully, "but I have a theory." "Talk." When Phantom agreed to disappear, when he refused to testify and went into self-imposed exile, the federal case against March collapsed. But the investigation generated something that March couldn't destroy: a file. Documentary evidence, transaction records, account numbers, routing information, names of associates across 4 states. The feds compiled it during the investigation and sealed it when the case fell apart. "Phantom had a copy," Ash said. It wasn't a question. Phantom was the only civilian with direct knowledge of the investigation's scope. If he kept records, notes, copies of documents the feds showed him during his interviews, anything that could reconstruct the network March spent 2 decades rebuilding, those records would be the most dangerous thing in March's world. Because the money laundering operation he's running now through Ridgeline Capital uses the same network. Same routes, same methods, same people. If someone took Phantom's records and matched them against Ridgeline's current operations, the whole thing collapses, Graves finished. The whole thing collapses, and March goes to prison for the rest of his life. Graves looked at Ash. Ash looked back. The same thought passed between them. Visible, electric, inevitable. "That's why he bought the building," Graves said. "That's why he's pushing Lena out. He's not trying to flip the apartment. He's trying to search it. He's looking for whatever Phantom left behind. And once Lena's gone," Ash said, "he can tear the unit apart without anyone noticing." The wind outside picked up, a long, low howl that pressed against the walls of the clubhouse and found every gap, every crack, every imperfection in the structure. The bare bulb in the hallway swung harder. Shadows shifted. Graves pulled his phone from his pocket, dialed. It rang 4 times before a voice answered, groggy, confused, the voice of a man pulled from sleep. "Mace, it's Graves. Who's on watch at Millbrook?" A pause. The sound of sheets moving. Sutton took the midnight shift. Should still be there. Call him, now. Tell him nobody enters that building. Nobody. Not Crow, not maintenance, not anyone he doesn't recognize. And tell him to check on Lena and Ellie." "Graves, it's 3 a.m. "Call him now." He hung up. His hand was steady, but his jaw was wire-tight, the tendons in his neck standing like cables under the skin. He looked at Rachel Dunn, who was packing her files back into the messenger bag with the efficient movements of someone who had delivered her payload and understood it was time to leave. "Ms. Dunn, what do I owe you?" "Nothing." She stood up, slung the bag over her shoulder. "I took this meeting because your associate told me Crow was squeezing a single mother on a ventilator out of her apartment so a developer could flip the property. I've spent 8 years watching men like March and Crow gut this city block by block. And the state won't touch them because the tax revenue from their developments is too valuable. So no, you don't owe me anything." She paused at the door. "But I'll tell you something for free." Graves waited. March is careful, meticulous. He spent 20 years building a system that's designed to withstand exactly the kind of pressure you're trying to apply. Cash on the desk won't work. Intimidation won't work. And if you go at him directly, the way men in your position tend to do, he'll use it. He'll call the police. He'll file harassment charges. He'll get restraining orders against every member of your club, and then he'll use those orders to put men on parole back in prison. He wants you to make a mistake, Mr. Mercer. He's counting on it." "Then what do you suggest?" Rachel looked at him with eyes that had seen 100 of these fights and knew how most of them ended. "Find the file. Whatever Phantom kept, find it before March does. Because right now, that file is the only thing in the world that scares a man like Devlin March more than a room full of bikers." She left. The steel door closed behind her with a metallic finality that rang through the clubhouse like the last note of something ending. Graves stood at the table for a long time after she was gone. Tank sat in a chair that groaned beneath his weight, his massive arms folded across his chest, his face working through expressions that ranged from rage to grief to a kind of bewildered heartbreak that looked wrong on a man his size, like watching a mountain try to cry. "Phantom knew," Tank said finally. His voice was thick. He knew March was still out there. He knew he was still in danger, and he never called us, never asked for help, never even sent a message. "He was protecting us," Ash said. "Same as before. He was protecting everybody except himself." Tank's fist hit the table. Not hard, but hard enough to rattle the coffee cups and make Ash's laptop jump half an inch. 15 years he carried this alone, sick, broke, watching over his shoulder every single day. And we were right here, and he wouldn't pick up the phone. "Because the phone was the danger," Paulo said quietly. He hadn't moved from his position against the wall. His voice carried the weight of someone who understood operational security not as an abstract concept, but as a daily reality. The reality of a man who had spent a year in Vietnam, never sleeping in the same location twice, because the jungle taught you that patterns were death sentences. Any contact with the club could have led March straight to us. Phantom didn't call because calling would have given March exactly what he wanted, a connection between Phantom and the Iron Vultures, a thread to pull. "And now March has the thread anyway," Graves said, "because Ellie walked into Blackline." The statement landed like a grenade with the pin already pulled. Every man in the room understood the implication simultaneously. If March was watching the building, and a man who'd spent 20 years tracking a ghost was certainly watching the building, then he'd seen the Harleys, he'd seen the leather cuts, he'd seen 10 men from a motorcycle club show up at Millbrook Terrace in the middle of the night and not leave until morning. He knew exactly what had happened. The connection Phantom had spent 15 years severing was now reattached, and March would be calculating what that meant for his $47 million operation. "He knows about us," Ash said. "If he didn't before the diner, he does now. Crow's meeting today, he wasn't just refusing to withdraw the eviction. He was buying time, reporting back to March. And March is going to move," Graves said. "Fast. He can't afford to wait. Every day that Lena's still in that apartment is another day someone might find whatever Phantom hid. And now that we're in the picture—" He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. His phone buzzed. A text from Mace. Sutton's not answering. Graves stared at the screen. The letters glowed in the dim room. He read them twice. "Tank? Keys." "What?" "Keys. Now. We're going to Millbrook." They moved faster than men their age should have been able to. Tank grabbed the truck keys from the hook by the door. Ash swept his laptop into a bag. Hollow was already outside, moving through the dark toward his Harley with the fluid, silent gait of a man who had been woken by alarms in the night 1,000 times before and had never once hesitated. 3 engines fired in the gravel lot. Headlights cut the darkness. Graves was on his bike before the others, kicking the Harley to life with a ferocity that turned the ignition into an act of war. The engine roared, a deep, guttural thunder that shattered the desert silence and sent something small and unseen scattering through the brush at the edge of the lot. They rode hard. 90 on the straightaway, leaning into turns that the cold pavement made treacherous, eating the 17 miles between the clubhouse and the city like men outrunning something they couldn't see. The wind was brutal, 40 degrees and dropping, cutting through leather and denim and skin until Graves's hands ached on the handlebars and his eyes burned from the cold. Millbrook Terrace came into view at 3:41 a.m. The first thing Graves noticed was the truck. Sutton's truck, a black Ford F-150 with a dented rear bumper and Iron Vulture sticker on the back window, sat in its usual spot at the curb outside the building. Engine off, lights off. The driver's door was closed. The second thing he noticed was the building's front door. It was open. Not wide, maybe 4 inches, but open, hanging on its hinges with the casual wrongness of something that should have been locked and wasn't. Graves killed his engine half a block away. Tank and Hollow followed. They approached on foot, spreading out without discussion. Graves up the middle, Tank to the left, Hollow circling toward the building's rear exit. Boots on wet pavement. No talking, no signals. Just the automatic choreography of men who had walked into uncertain situations enough times to make caution feel like breathing. Graves reached the truck first. He looked through the driver's window. Sutton was inside. Slumped in the seat with his head tilted back against the headrest, mouth open. For one horrible, suspended second, Graves thought he was dead. Then Sutton's chest rose, shallow, labored, and Graves saw the blood. A cut above his left eye, crusted and dark. His right hand lay in his lap, swollen at the knuckles. The skin split across the first and second joints. He'd hit someone, or something, and someone had hit him back. Graves opened the door. Sutton. No response. Sutton. Louder. The man's eyes opened, unfocused, wandering. Then they found Graves's face, and something behind them ignited. Fear, confusion, pain. They came, Sutton said. His voice was slurred. Concussion, maybe. Or just the disorientation of being hit hard enough to lose time. Two guys. Suits. Middle of the night. I tried to... He winced. His hand went to his ribs, and the movement told Graves everything. Cracked, possibly broken. They said they were building inspectors. Emergency inspection. I told them to get lost. One of them... He coughed, blood on his lower lip. The other one came from behind. Where are they now? Went inside 20 minutes ago, maybe 30. I tried to follow, but... He gestured weakly at his ribs. His eyes were wet. Not from crying, from the pain, from the humiliation, from the specific kind of rage that comes from being a man whose job was to protect and failing. Stay here. Graves straightened up, looked at the building, the open door, the dark stairwell beyond. Tank appeared at his shoulder. What happened? Two men, inside, 20 to 30 minutes. They didn't discuss it. They went in. The stairwell was darker than before. The second-floor light that had been burned out was now joined by the third-floor light, which had been working 2 days ago. Someone had removed the bulbs. Deliberate. Professional. The darkness was a tool, and whoever was using it knew what they were doing. Graves took the stairs with his back against the wall and his hand trailing the railing. Tank followed 3 steps behind, close enough to respond, far enough to avoid being caught in the same ambush. Their boots were loud in the silence. Each step echoed upward through the stairwell like a countdown. 3rd floor. The hallway stretched toward apartment 3C. The door was closed, but not fully. The same 4-inch gap, the same wrongness. And from inside, barely audible over the hum of the oxygen concentrator, came the sound of drawers being opened and closed. Carefully. Methodically. The sound of someone searching. Graves pushed the door open. 2 men stood in Lena Vale's kitchen. Both wore dark clothing, not suits, despite what Sutton said, but dark jackets over dark shirts. Both had gloves. One was crouched beside the kitchen cabinets, pulling them open one at a time, running his hand along the back of each shelf. The other stood by the refrigerator, which had been pulled away from the wall to expose the space behind it. He had a flashlight, a small, precise beam, and he was scanning the gap between the appliance and the drywall with the systematic attention of someone who had done this before. They both froze when the door opened. The one by the refrigerator moved first. He straightened, turned, and his hand went to his waistband. Not a gun, but a phone. Speed dial. Reporting. Alerting. The one by the cabinet stood up slowly, his eyes moving from Graves to Tank in the doorway behind him, calculating odds, distances, exits. "Get out," Graves said. His voice wasn't loud. It wasn't threatening. It was something worse. Absolute. The voice of a man who had moved past the negotiation phase of everything and arrived at a place where the next thing that happened would be determined entirely by the choices other people made in the next 3 seconds. The man by the cabinets was younger, late 20s, athletic build, the hard eyes of someone who worked in private security and had been trained to maintain control in confrontational situations. He held his ground. "We're conducting an emergency building inspection authorized by..." Tank stepped past Graves. 1 step. That was all it took. 300 pounds of scarred, tattooed force moving through a doorway with the unhurried inevitability of a freight train. and the younger man's composure cracked like thin ice. He took a step backward. His hip hit the counter. His hand came up, palm out, reflexive, the universal gesture of a man who has just realized he is not the most dangerous thing in the room. "I said get out," Graves repeated. The man by the refrigerator pocketed his phone. He looked at his partner. Some communication passed between them, a glance, a micro-expression, a calculation completed in silence. Then the man by the refrigerator nodded once, and both of them moved toward the door. They had to pass Tank to leave. They did it sideways, pressing against the wall, their bodies angled to minimize contact. The younger one's jaw was clenched. The older one's face was blank, professionally blank. The blankness of a man who was already composing his report. They left. Footsteps in the hallway, on the stairs, and then gone. Graves stood in the kitchen. The cabinets were open. The refrigerator was pulled from the wall. A drawer near the sink had been emptied. Its contents, silverware, a can opener, rubber bands, takeout menus, spread across the counter in a pattern that suggested systematic removal and inspection. They'd been searching, just as Rachel predicted, looking for whatever Phantom had hidden. Graves moved through the apartment quickly. The living room was undisturbed. Lena's hospital bed, the oxygen concentrator, the pill bottles on the windowsill. Lena herself was asleep or unconscious, her breathing shallow and rhythmic beneath the oxygen cannula. She hadn't heard. The medication she took at night ensured that. Ellie's room. The door was closed. Graves opened it slowly, expecting to see the girl asleep, expecting the twin mattress and the schoolbooks and the photograph of Phantom on the wall. The bed was empty. The covers were pulled back. The pillow still held the impression of her head. But Ellie was gone. Graves's heart stopped. Not metaphorically. He felt it freeze in his chest like an engine seizing, one terrible fraction of a second where the world went white, and every worst-case scenario he'd ever constructed in 61 years of hard living converged into a single point of absolute annihilating terror. Then a sound. Small, close. Beneath him. He looked down. Ellie was under the bed, curled into a ball, pressed against the wall, her knees drawn to her chest and her arms wrapped around something rectangular. A metal box, small, dented, the kind you'd use to store tools or documents. She was shaking. Her eyes were open, wide, staring at him from the darkness beneath the bed frame with the primal, cornered animal focus of a child who had heard strangers in her home and done the only thing her instincts knew how to do. She'd hidden, and she'd taken the box with her. "Ellie," Graves whispered. He knelt down. His knee screamed. He ignored it. He lowered himself until his face was level with hers, until he could see her eyes clearly in the thin light from the hallway. "It's me. It's Graves. They're gone." She didn't move. Her grip on the box tightened. Her knuckles were white. "Ellie, you're safe. I'm right here." A long pause. A breath. Another. Then, slowly, so slowly it hurt to watch, she uncurled, pushed herself out from under the bed on her stomach, dragging the box with her, and when she was clear, she sat up on the floor and looked at Graves with an expression that no 9-year-old should ever wear. She wasn't scared anymore. She was done being scared. What was left was something harder, colder, older, the look of someone who had crossed a threshold in the night and could not go back. "They were looking for this," she said. Her voice was steady, flat. "Dad told me about it. Before he died. He said people might come looking for it. He said to hide it and never tell anyone." Graves looked at the box. Small, metal, locked with a combination padlock that was scratched and dull with age. "What's in it, Ellie?" "I don't know. Dad said I'd know when to open it." She looked at him, looked through him, really, the way her father used to look through walls and weather and lies. "I think it's now." Graves reached for the box, then he stopped. His hand hung in the air between them, and in that suspended moment, he understood something that changed the shape of everything. This wasn't a rescue anymore. It never had been. From the moment Ellie walked into Black Line Diner, she hadn't been looking for shelter. She'd been carrying a weapon, the one thing Phantom had left behind that could destroy Devlin March and every dollar he'd built on 20 years of laundered money, and she'd walked it straight into the hands of the only men her father trusted to use it. Phantom hadn't sent his daughter to find protection. He'd sent her to finish the war. And now Graves sat on a cold floor in a dark apartment with a locked box in front of him and a 9-year-old girl beside him, and the weight of a dead man's final move pressing down on his shoulders like the sky itself. Outside, the wind howled through the broken streetlights of Millbrook Terrace. Somewhere in the distance, a siren wailed and faded. And in a warehouse office on the east side of Reno, a phone was ringing. The older man's report arriving on a desk where Devlin March, who had waited 20 years for this moment, was about to learn that the thing he'd been searching for was no longer in the apartment. It was in the hands of the Iron Vultures, and the hunt was about to become a war. The combination was Ellie's birthday. She told him without being asked, April 17th, 2016, and Graves turned the dials with fingers that felt like they belonged to someone else. The lock clicked. The lid opened. And inside, wrapped in a plastic freezer bag sealed with duct tape, was a manila envelope thick enough to bend under its own weight. Graves pulled it out. The plastic crinkled in the silence. He peeled the tape, opened the bag, and slid the contents onto the floor between them. Documents. Dozens of them. Bank statements from accounts in 3 states. Wire transfer records with routing numbers circled in black ink. A hand-drawn diagram of a distribution network. Names, locations, arrows connecting them like veins in a body. Photographs. Grainy, printed on standard paper, showing men exchanging envelopes in parking lots, loading crates into unmarked vans, standing outside businesses that Graves recognized as fronts because he'd spent 40 years in a world where fronts were as common as gas stations. And at the bottom of the stack, a single sheet of yellow legal paper covered in Phantom's handwriting, tight, angular, the penmanship of a man writing fast because time was something he didn't have enough of. Graves read the yellow page. It was a letter. Not addressed to anyone, no name at the top, no greeting, just words poured onto paper like blood from a wound. If you're reading this, I'm gone. And if Ellie brought you this box, it means the world finally did what I spent 15 years praying it wouldn't. It came from my family. Everything in this envelope is real. I kept copies of what the feds showed me during the investigation. I kept my own records too, dates, transactions, names. March thought the case died when I disappeared. It didn't die. I just buried it somewhere he couldn't reach. I know what I did to the club. I know what it looked like. I know Graves spent years hating me for leaving without a word. I'd have hated me too. But March had people inside the investigation. If I told anyone, where I was going or why, the information would have reached him within days, and he would have come. Not for me, for Lena, for the baby she was carrying. I chose them. I chose my daughter over my brothers, and I'd make the same choice every time, even knowing what it cost. But here's the thing about choices. They don't end when you make them. They keep growing, keep reaching. And the choice I'm making now, putting this box in my daughter's hands, is the last one I'll ever make. I'm trusting her to carry it to the only men in the world I'd trust with my family and with this fight. Graves, if it's you reading this, I'm sorry for all of it. And I'm asking you one more time to do what you've always done better than anyone I've ever known. Protect what matters. Graves set the letter down. His hands were shaking, not from cold, not from fear, from something that had no name and no bottom, a grief so delayed and so total that it felt less like an emotion and more like a physical law, gravity pulling everything inside him toward a center that couldn't hold. He folded the letter carefully, put it back in the envelope, put the envelope back in the box, closed the lid. Tank, he said. Tank stood in the doorway, filling it. Yeah. Get Lena ready to move. Now. Tonight. We're taking them to the clubhouse. What about Sutton? Hospital. Broken ribs, possible concussion. Call Mace. Have him meet the ambulance. And Tank... Graves looked up. Call Deacon. Tank's eyebrows rose. Tell him the 72 hours are over. Tell him what we found. And tell him I need every brother at the table by sunrise. They moved Lena in the dark. Tank carried the oxygen concentrator. Ash, who had arrived 12 minutes after Graves's call, dismantled the portable tank setup and loaded it into the truck bed. Hollow carried Lena herself. She weighed nothing in his arms. 87 pounds of illness and exhaustion wrapped in a blanket, her oxygen cannula connected to a portable unit that Ash held at her side as they descended the stairs. She was conscious, but barely, her eyes fluttering open and closed, her lips moving around words that didn't quite form. Ellie walked beside Hollow, one hand resting on her mother's arm, the other clutching the metal box against her chest. They loaded Lena into the truck's back seat, propped against pillows pulled from her bed. Ellie climbed in beside her. Graves took the passenger seat. Tank drove. Behind them, Ash and Hollow rode their Harleys, exhaust vapor rising into the freezing pre-dawn air like the breath of animals running in the dark. No one spoke during the drive. The highway was empty, a black ribbon cutting through desert that stretched to every horizon. The only light came from the truck's headlights and the twin beams of the Harleys behind them. The only sound was the engine, the tires on asphalt, and the rhythmic hiss of Lena's oxygen. Graves watched the road. His jaw was locked. His eyes were fixed on the vanishing point where the headlights dissolved into darkness. In his mind, he was building something, a structure made of facts, risks, and possibilities. A plan. The plan Deacon had demanded. The plan that would determine whether the Iron Vultures survived the next 48 hours or shattered against a man with 20 years of preparation and 47 million reasons to destroy them. They reached the clubhouse at 4:50 a.m. Tank backed the truck to the door. They moved Lena inside, setting up her equipment in the back room that had once been Graves's private office, the quietest space in the building, with a door that locked and walls thick enough to muffle the sound of 15 motorcycles idling in the yard. Ellie sat beside her mother on a cot they'd assembled from spare parts and old blankets. Lena's breathing had stabilized during the drive. The oxygen concentrator hummed. The pill bottles were arranged on a shelf within reach. Ellie had organized them, precisely, automatically, with the practiced efficiency of a child who had been managing her mother's medication for longer than anyone knew. Graves watched her from the doorway. She didn't look up. "Ellie," she raised her head. Those eyes, Phantom's eyes. "You did good tonight." She nodded. Then, "Are they going to come back?" Graves didn't lie to her. He'd spent his life lying to people who needed comfort, and he'd learned that the ones who survived were always the ones who got the truth. "Yeah," he said, "they're going to come back." "Can you stop them?" He looked at her for a long time, at the metal box on the floor beside her, at the locked door, the humming machines, the sleeping woman who didn't know yet how much danger she was in. "I'm going to try." Ellie held his gaze. Then she reached down, picked up the box, and held it out to him. "Then you need this more than I do." He took it. It weighed almost nothing, and everything. By 6 a.m., 12 men sat around the scarred wooden table in the main room of the Iron Vultures clubhouse. Every chair was filled. The overhead lights, all of them for once, were on, casting the room in harsh yellow that erased shadows and left nowhere to hide. Coffee cups. Cigarette smoke. The smell of leather and tension, and men who hadn't slept. Deacon sat at the far end of the table, opposite Graves. His arms were crossed. His face was unreadable. But he was there. He'd come when called, and in the silent language of the club, that meant the door was still open. Graves didn't ease into it. He set the metal box on the table, opened it, and spread Phantom's documents across the scarred wood like a field surgeon laying out instruments before an operation. Then he talked. He told them everything. March, Ridgeline Capital, the money laundering network, the connection to Phantom's disappearance, the men who'd broken into Lena's apartment, Sutton's injuries, the search for the file. He told them about Rachel Dunn's analysis and Hollow's observation about Crow's reaction. He told them about the letter. He read the letter aloud, every word. His voice didn't break, but when he finished, the room was different. Something had shifted in the molecular structure of the air, a change so fundamental that every man felt it simultaneously, the way animals feel earthquakes before the ground moves. Mace spoke first. Mace, who had sided with Deacon, who had questioned the club's involvement, who had argued that Phantom's family wasn't their responsibility. His voice was raw. He went through all that, alone, for 15 years. Nobody answered. Nobody needed to. Graves looked at Deacon. "There's your plan," he said. "We take this file to a federal prosecutor. Not local, federal." March's operation spans multiple states. The transaction records match Ridgeline Capital's current structure. A forensic accountant has already confirmed the pattern. We hand over the evidence, the feds reopen the investigation, and March's entire world burns down from the inside. No violence, no arrests for us, no parole violations. Legal, clean, final. Deacon studied the documents. His eyes moved across the pages with the methodical precision of a man who understood tactical intelligence. The difference between information and evidence, between a lead and a weapon. How do we know the feds won't turn this around on us? He asked. Not hostile, genuine. The question of a man doing his job. We show up with documents from a sealed federal investigation. First question they ask is how we got them. Second question is what our connection to the original case was. Third question is whether any of us were involved in the transactions March was laundering money through. We weren't, Graves said. Phantom was buying parts through March's shop, standard transactions. Nothing illegal on our end. The feds knew that 20 years ago. That's why they wanted Phantom as a witness, not a defendant. 20 years ago, different agents, different priorities. You think a new team is going to look at a motorcycle club, handing them sealed case documents and say, "Thank you, gentlemen, no further questions"? That's why we don't hand it over directly. Graves pulled a business card from his jacket and placed it on the table. Rachel Dunn's card. We go through her. She's a former state AG investigator with contacts in the federal system. She acts as intermediary. The documents come from a confidential source, Phantom's estate, routed through a forensic accountant with credibility the feds trust. Our name never appears on anything. Deacon picked up the card, looked at it, looked at Graves. And Crow? Crow's a puppet. March pulls the strings. When March goes down, Crow goes down with him. Every property, every LLC, every eviction he filed as part of the scheme becomes evidence in a federal racketeering case. Lena's eviction gets vacated. Millbrook Terrace gets seized. Problem solved. The table was quiet. Men looked at each other. At the documents, at Graves, at Deacon. Then Deacon nodded. Once. Small, but definitive. It holds, he said. One condition. Name it. Until the feds move on March, this club goes to ground. No contact with Crow. No rides past his properties. No intimidation. Nothing that gives March's lawyers a single frame of footage or a single witness statement that puts us within a mile of his operation. We become ghosts. Agreed. And the girl and her mother stay here, under full protection, rotating shifts, armed. Already in place. Deacon looked at Graves across the length of the table. The distance between them, the same distance that had felt like a border 2 days ago, now felt like something else. A bridge. Damaged, strained, but holding. Then we ride, Deacon said. At 9 a.m., Ash delivered the documents to Rachel Dunn's office in a sealed case with a chain of custody log that would hold up in any courtroom in the country. Rachel had a meeting with a federal prosecutor in Las Vegas scheduled for the following morning. A woman she'd worked with before, someone she trusted, someone who understood that the most important cases in law enforcement often arrived not through official channels, but through the back doors that career investigators spent decades building. The plan was in motion, clean, legal, surgical, and then everything went wrong. It started with a phone call at 11:47 a.m. Graves was in the clubhouse yard, leaning against Tank's truck, smoking a cigarette and watching the desert heat shimmer above the gravel lot. His phone rang. Unknown number. He answered. Mr. Mercer. The voice was male, calm, educated. The kind of calm that comes from absolute confidence, and the kind of education that teaches a man how to destroy lives without ever raising his voice. My name is David Kellner. I believe we have some business to discuss. Graves's cigarette stopped halfway to his mouth. David Kellner, March's alias. I don't know anyone by that name, Graves said. Let me help your memory. You visited one of my properties 2 days ago. You attempted to bribe my property manager with cash. And last night, you assaulted 2 of my employees conducting a lawful building inspection and removed a tenant from the premises without authorization. A pause. Calculated. I have all of this documented. Photographs, witness statements, security footage. What do you want? I want what belongs to me. You have documents that were stolen from a federal investigation 20 years ago. Possessing them is a felony. Distributing them is obstruction of justice. And if those documents reach a prosecutor's desk, the first person they'll investigate isn't me. It's the man who provided them. Graves's hand tightened on the phone. You've got nothing. I have everything, Mr. Mercer. I've had 20 years to build a paper trail that leads away from me and toward anyone foolish enough to challenge it. Do you think I rebuilt an operation of this scale without contingency plans? Without fall guys? Without documentation that shows your club's fingerprints on transactions that you didn't even know were happening? The words landed like ice in Graves's bloodstream. He thought of what Deacon had warned, the feds turning the investigation around. March had been planning for this. For 20 years. Not just hiding his operation, but building a trap. A dead man's switch made of fabricated records and planted evidence designed to redirect any investigation toward anyone who tried to bring him down. I'll make this simple, March continued. You have something I want. I have something you need. The freedom of every man in your club who's on parole, on probation, or one mistake away from a cell. Return the documents. Walk away. And this ends. Everyone goes home. Nobody gets hurt. And Lena Vale, her daughter? Ms. Vale's tenancy will be terminated per the existing legal proceedings. She'll be given 30 days to vacate. Standard process. Humane. You're going to tear that apartment apart the second she's gone. What I do with my properties is my concern. Graves closed his eyes. The cigarette burned between his fingers, ash growing long, untouched. The desert wind pulled at his jacket. He could hear the faint hum of Harleys being worked on in the garage, the sound of men maintaining machines they might need to ride into something unforgiving. You've got 24 hours, March said. After that, I file criminal complaints, assault, breaking and entering, theft of federal documents, harassment, and I make a very detailed call to every parole officer attached to every name on your club's charter. Another pause. Longer this time. 24 hours, Mr. Mercer. Use them wisely. The line went dead. Graves stood in the yard for a long time. The cigarette burned down to his fingers. He let it. The pain was small and specific and real, the only thing in that moment that he could control. Then he went inside. He found Ash in the main room, typing furiously on his laptop. Ash! Stop! We have a problem. He relayed the call, word for word. The room filled as he spoke, Tank drifting in from the garage, Hollow from the hallway, Deacon from the back entrance where he'd been checking the perimeter. By the time Graves finished, every brother who'd been at the table that morning was back, and the energy in the room had transformed from the cautious optimism of a plan coming together to the electric dread of a plan coming apart. He's bluffing, Mace said. Fabricated records. That's conspiracy to frame. The feds would see through it. Would they? Deacon's voice cut through the room like a blade. In what timeline? After 6 months of investigation? A year? 2 years? While they sort through 20 years of March's paper trail, which of us sits in a cell waiting for the truth to come out? He looked around the table. Tank, you've got 3 years left on parole, 1 arrest, 1, and you're back inside for the full 7. You willing to bet that the federal government moves faster than March's lawyers? Tank said nothing. His face was stone, but his hands, resting on the table, were trembling. He's right, Ash said quietly. Everyone looked at him. Ash rarely conceded to Deacon on anything, and the admission carried the weight of a white flag. March has had 20 years to prepare for exactly this scenario. If he says he has fabricated records linking us to his transactions, he probably does. Giving the documents to the feds doesn't just expose March. It triggers whatever dead man's switch he's built. And we have no way of knowing what that switch looks like until it's too late. The room was suffocating. 12 men in a concrete building, surrounded by motorcycles and desert, and every exit was closing. Graves looked at Hollow. Hollow, who hadn't spoken, who was leaning against the wall with his arms at his sides and his pale eyes fixed on a point somewhere beyond the room, beyond the walls, beyond the present moment. Hollow. The old man's eyes refocused, slow, deliberate, like a rifle scope adjusting for distance. He called you, Hollow said, on your phone, which means he has your number. which means he's been watching longer than we thought. The apartment search wasn't his first move, it was his latest. What are you saying? I'm saying a man who has your personal phone number also knows where this clubhouse is, where we ride, who our families are, where Tank's sister lives, where Mace's ex-wife takes his son to school. Hollow's voice was flat, depthless, the voice of a man describing a perimeter breach. He's not just threatening our freedom, he's threatening our people. The statement detonated silently. Every man in the room felt the blast radius. Graves gripped the edge of the table. His knuckles were white. His arms shook, not from weakness, but from the physical effort of containing something that wanted to erupt. So we're trapped, Mace said. We give back the documents. March wins. We give them to the feds. March triggers his contingency and we all go down. We do nothing. He files complaints and we go down anyway. There's another option, Graves said. Every head turned. We don't go to the feds. We don't give back the documents. We go to March directly. Deacon's chair scraped against the concrete. Absolutely not. Not to fight, not to threaten. Graves's voice was controlled, measured, but underneath it, underneath the discipline and the decades of leadership, was something raw and molten. To negotiate, face to face, man to man. Negotiate what? He holds every card. He holds one card. Fear. He's counting on us being afraid of what happens if we push back. He's counting on parole conditions and criminal records and the weight of everything we've done wrong in our lives to keep us in line. Graves looked around the table. Every face, every scar, every set of eyes that had seen the inside of a system designed to break men exactly like them. But he forgot something. What? We've already lost everything before, most of us. Prison, families, jobs, dignity. We've been at zero. We've been below zero. And we're still here. He straightened up. March has $47 million, a network of lawyers, and 20 years of planning. We have Phantom's file and 12 men who've survived worse than anything a real estate developer can throw at us. Graves, Deacon started. I'm not done. His voice dropped. The room contracted. Here's what March doesn't know. Rachel Dunn made copies, 3 sets. One is in her office safe, one is in a bank deposit box in Las Vegas. And one, he pulled a USB drive from his jacket and set it on the table, is right here. Even if we gave back the originals, the evidence exists in places he can't reach. The dead man's switch goes both ways. Ash looked at the USB drive, then at Graves. Something new behind his eyes, not hope exactly, but the recognition that the game had changed. You want to tell him that, Ash said, to his face. I want to sit across from Devlin March and tell him that if anything happens to this club, any arrest, any parole violation, any threat to any family connected to us, 3 copies of Phantom's file go to 3 different federal prosecutors simultaneously. I want to tell him that his contingency plan means nothing because the evidence is already beyond his control. And I want to watch him understand that the only way he survives this is by leaving Lena Vale, Ellie Vale, and the Iron Vultures completely alone, permanently. Silence. Then Deacon leaned forward, his elbows on the table, his pale green eyes locked on Graves. That's mutually assured destruction. Yes. If he doesn't believe you, if he thinks you're bluffing, he'll trigger everything. He'll believe me. Graves's voice was iron. Because I'm going to bring Phantom's daughter with me. The room erupted. Not in shouting, the Iron Vultures didn't shout, but in the sharp overlapping speech of men who had all reached the same conclusion simultaneously and were expressing it from 12 different angles of alarm. You can't bring a kid into a meeting with, "That's insane, Graves." March will see it as a provocation. Listen. Graves's voice cut through the noise like an axe through kindling. The room went silent. Absolutely, instantly silent. March has spent 20 years afraid of a ghost. A dead man he couldn't find, couldn't control, couldn't silence. He bought buildings, hired men, built an empire of shell companies and fabricated records, all because of one man's memory. That's not business. That's obsession. That's fear. Graves picked up the USB drive and held it in his fist. When he sees Phantom's daughter walk into that room, carrying her father's face, her father's eyes, her father's unbreakable stubbornness, he's going to understand something that no threat and no document and no lawyer can communicate. What? That Phantom is still alive. In her. In us. In every copy of that file that's sitting in every safe in every city he can't reach. And that the only way to kill Phantom for good is to destroy all of it. And he can't. He can't destroy all of it. It's too late. Graves looked around the table. 12 faces, 12 histories, 12 men who had walked into this clubhouse carrying different wounds, different failures, different reasons for being here, but who had stayed because the table held them together the way gravity holds planets in orbit. Not perfectly, not gently, but absolutely. "I'm asking for a vote," he said. "Full table. Majority rules." Deacon looked at him. A long, searching look, the kind that passes between men who have disagreed about everything and agree about the one thing that matters. "All in favor of the meet," Deacon said. His voice was quiet but clear. 12 hands went up. Everyone, including Deacon's. The meeting was set for 10 o'clock that night. Neutral ground, a closed body shop on the industrial strip south of Reno that the club had used for negotiations before. Ash made the call to March's number using a burner phone. The terms were simple. Graves, 2 escorts, and 1 civilian. March could bring whatever he wanted. The location was public enough to discourage anything reckless, private enough to allow honesty. March agreed. Quickly. Too quickly, Hollow noted. The eagerness of a man who believed he was walking into a surrender. At 9:30 p.m., 4 Harleys and Tank's truck pulled out of the clubhouse lot. Graves rode point. Tank and Deacon flanked. Hollow brought up the rear. In the truck, driven by Ash, sat Ellie Vale, wearing clean clothes that the bikers had bought that afternoon, her dark hair combed for the first time in days, Phantom's metal box on the seat beside her. She hadn't argued when Graves asked her. She hadn't hesitated. She'd looked at him with those ancient eyes and said 2 words. "I'm ready." They rode in formation through the Nevada night, 5 machines cutting through cold air under a sky so clear the stars looked like bullet holes in black fabric. The desert stretched away on both sides, vast and indifferent. The road hummed beneath their tires. At 9:58 p.m., they pulled into the body shop's gravel lot. 3 vehicles were already there, a black SUV, a silver sedan, and a white Mercedes that gleamed under the parking lot's single floodlight like a tooth in a dark mouth. Graves killed his engine. The others followed. Silence flooded back in, the desert's natural state, broken only by the tick of cooling engines and the distant cry of something wild and unseen. He looked at Ellie through the truck's window. She was sitting straight, hands in her lap, face composed. The metal box rested against her hip. "Stay with Ash until I come for you," Graves said. She nodded. Graves walked toward the body shop's side entrance, Tank on his right, Deacon on his left. Their boots crunched on gravel. The floodlight threw their shadows long and sharp across the ground. 3 silhouettes moving toward a door behind which a man who had spent 20 years building an empire on fear was waiting to learn whether fear was enough. Graves put his hand on the door handle. Cold metal. He could feel his heartbeat in his palm, steady, heavy, the rhythm of a machine that had been running for 61 years and wasn't done yet. He pushed the door open, and there, standing in the center of a concrete floor beneath the blue-white glare of industrial fluorescence, surrounded by the ghosts of stripped cars and the smell of old grease and new money, stood Devlin March. Older, heavier, his hair silver and thin, his eyes carrying the particular emptiness of a man who had replaced every human connection in his life with transactions. March looked at Graves. Graves looked at March. 20 years of distance, 20 years of a dead man between them. "Mr. Mercer," March said, "you brought friends." Graves didn't answer. He turned and nodded toward the truck. The passenger door opened. Ellie stepped out into the floodlight, small, straight-backed, Phantom's face in miniature, carrying a dented metal box in both hands like a soldier carrying a flag into territory that had been lost and was about to be reclaimed. She walked toward the body shop door. Her sneakers crunched on the gravel. Each step deliberate. Each step closer. March saw her, and for the first time in 20 years, for the first time since he'd watched a man named Phantom Vale disappear into the American night carrying secrets that could end everything, Devlin March's composure cracked. It was small, a twitch at the corner of his mouth, a shift in his stance, a flicker behind those empty eyes that looked, for one unguarded second, exactly like what it was. Terror. Ellie stopped in the doorway. She looked at March, looked through him, the same way her father used to look through walls and weather and lies. "My name is Ellie Vale," she said, "and my dad has something to say to you." March didn't speak for 7 seconds. 7 seconds in a room like that, concrete floor, fluorescent lights, the smell of old grease and cold metal, was an eternity. Graves counted every one of them because counting kept him anchored, kept the fury in his chest from detonating before the moment was right. Tank stood to his right like a wall made of scar tissue and silence. Deacon stood to his left, coiled, his pale green eyes locked on the two men flanking March, both large, both in dark suits, both carrying the particular stillness of private security, trained to respond to signals invisible to anyone outside the arrangement. Ellie stood in the doorway. She hadn't moved past the threshold. The metal box rested in her hands. The floodlight behind her threw her shadow long and thin across the concrete floor, stretching all the way to March's polished shoes. March recovered. You could see it happen, the crack in his composure sealing over, the mask sliding back into place like a visor closing. He adjusted his jacket, straightened his cuffs, and when he spoke, his voice carried the same educated, frictionless calm that had characterized the phone call. "Using a child," he said. "That's a new low, even for men like you." "She asked to come," Graves said. "I'm sure she did. Children can be coached to say anything." "She's not coached. She's Phantom's daughter, and she's carrying the last thing Phantom ever left behind." March's eyes dropped to the box. Just for a second, a fraction. But Graves caught it. The same involuntary recognition response Hollow had identified in Crow's office. The gravitational pull of something you've been hunting for 20 years suddenly materializing in a child's hands. "Mr. Mercer, I came here to resolve this civilly. I outlined my terms on the phone. Return what doesn't belong to you, and we all walk away." "Your terms?" Graves took one step forward. His boot hit the concrete with a sound that echoed off the walls. "Your terms are a threat wrapped in a handshake. You want me to believe that a man who's been laundering money through real estate for 2 decades, who tracked a dying man across 4 states, who sent men into a sick woman's apartment at 3 in the morning, is offering a civil resolution?" March's jaw tightened, the smallest movement. "You're making accusations you can't support." "I can support every one of them, and so can the 3 copies of Phantom's file that are sitting in 3 different locations right now, waiting for a phone call." The room changed. Not visibly. Nothing moved. No one shifted. But the electromagnetic charge between the 2 men altered, the way air changes before lightning. March's security detail registered it. One of them took a half step forward. Deacon's hand moved. Not far, not fast, just enough to make the geometry clear. 3 copies, March repeated. One with a forensic accountant who used to work for the state AG. One in a bank vault in Las Vegas. One on a drive in my jacket. Graves kept his voice flat, factual. The voice of a man laying cards on a table. "You can take the originals. I'll hand them over right now. But the copies stay. And here's what happens with them." He paused. "Let the silence do its work. If anything happens to this club, any arrest, any parole violation triggered by fabricated evidence, any anonymous complaint to any officer of the court, 1 copy goes to the FBI's Organized Crime Division. If anything happens to Lena Vale or Ellie Vale, eviction, harassment, a stranger in their hallway, a power outage that lasts 1 minute longer than it should, the 2nd copy goes to the Department of Justice. And if anything happens to me, anything at all, the 3rd copy goes to every major newspaper in Nevada with a cover letter from a forensic accountant who can explain exactly what Ridgeline Capital is and where the money comes from." March stared at him. The emptiness in his eyes had been replaced by something active, calculating, the rapid, desperate computation of a man running scenarios and finding no exit. "That's blackmail," March said. "That's insurance," Graves said. "The same kind you've been carrying for 20 years. The only difference is I'm telling you about mine." March's hands flexed at his sides. Open, closed, open. The gold watch on his wrist caught the fluorescent light and threw a small, bright shard across the ceiling. "And what do you want?" March asked. The civility was gone from his voice. What remained was the real thing underneath, hard, bitter, corroded by 2 decades of maintaining a lie. Specifically, what do you want in exchange for not destroying everything I've built? 3 things. Graves held up one finger. Lena Vale's eviction is withdrawn, permanently. Her rent is waived for the remainder of her tenancy, however long that is. If she lives another year or another 30 years, she doesn't pay a dime. Second finger. Vincent Crowe sells Millbrook Terrace to a nonprofit housing organization. I don't care which one. I don't care what he loses on the deal. The building gets transferred to people who will maintain it and protect the tenants who've been living under his neglect. Third finger. You disappear. From Reno. From Nevada. From any state where Phantom's file connects you to laundered money. You shut down Ridgeline Capital. You dissolve every LLC. And you never come within 100 miles of Phantom's family again. March laughed. It was short, ugly, stripped of humor. The sound of a man confronting an absurdity so total it bypassed anger and landed somewhere in the territory of disbelief. You're asking me to abandon a $47 million development. I'm asking you to walk away alive and free, which is more than you gave Phantom. The laughter died. March's face went still. Behind the mask, behind the suit, behind the 20 years of careful construction, something ancient surfaced. The original thing, the thing that had been there before the money and the lawyers and the shell companies. Fear. The same fear that had driven him to flip on his associates 20 years ago. The same fear that had made him spend 2 decades building walls around himself. The fear of a man who knew, at his core, that everything he had was built on sand. You can't enforce this, March said. His voice was quieter now, smaller. You can't guarantee that copies won't surface anyway. You can't guarantee that your forensic accountant won't decide to go to the feds on her own. You can't… You're right. Graves cut him off, not angry, almost gentle. The gentleness of a man closing a trap. I can't guarantee anything. That's the point. Neither can you, neither can anyone. That's what it feels like, March. Living without guarantees, without safety nets, without a system designed to protect you at everyone else's expense. He took another step forward, close enough now to see the pores on March's face, the broken capillaries beneath his eyes, the thin sheen of sweat on his upper lip. That's what Phantom lived with for 15 years. That's what his wife lives with every time she takes a breath through a machine. That's what his daughter has lived with since the day she was born. No guarantees, no protection, just survival. He reached into his jacket and pulled out the metal box, set it on a workbench between them. The sound of metal on metal rang through the body shop like a bell. Take your documents, Graves said. Take the originals and leave. March looked at the box, at Graves, at the men behind him, at Ellie, still standing in the doorway, still watching with those eyes that held 15 years of a dead man's vigilance. Then he reached for the box. His hand stopped 6 inches from the lid, because Ellie spoke. He forgave you. March froze. His hand hung in the air. He didn't look at her, couldn't look at her, or wouldn't, which amounted to the same thing. My dad, Ellie continued. Her voice was steady, clear. The voice of someone who had carried a message across miles and years and was finally delivering it to the only person who needed to hear it. He talked about you once, near the end. He was on a lot of medication and he said things he usually kept inside. He said you were scared. He said scared men do terrible things because they think survival is the same as strength. And he said he forgave you, not because you deserved it, because carrying it was killing him faster than the cancer. March's hand trembled, visibly. The tremor ran from his fingers to his wrist to his forearm, and he pulled his hand back and pressed it flat against his thigh to stop it. The same gesture Graves used, Tank used, every man in the room used when the body tried to express something the mind refused to authorize. He didn't speak for a long time. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. A draft moved through the body shop, carrying the smell of cold desert and distant exhaust. One of March's security men shifted his weight, uncomfortable, aware that whatever was happening in this room had moved beyond his training and his job description. March picked up the box, held it against his chest with both hands. His eyes were wet, not crying, not yet. But the surface tension holding everything in place was failing, and what was underneath was not the monster Graves had expected, but something sadder and more common. A man who had spent so long running from what he'd done that he'd forgotten there was ever a version of himself worth running toward. 30 days, March said. His voice was hoarse, damaged. I'll need 30 days to dissolve the entities and transfer the property. You have 14. March closed his eyes, opened them, nodded once. He turned and walked toward the back exit. His security detail fell in behind him. His shoes echoed on the concrete, expensive, precise, the sound of a world he'd built step by step now being walked away from. At the door, he stopped. The file, he said without turning around. The copies. If I do what you're asking, everything you're asking, will you destroy them? Graves looked at Deacon. Deacon looked at Graves. A conversation happened in the space between their eyes. Years of disagreement, years of tension, years of two men who led differently but protected the same thing. Deacon nodded. When it's done, Graves said, when Lena's safe, the building's transferred, and you're gone. When I can look at that girl and tell her that the thing her father spent his life running from is finally over. Then, and not 1 second before, the copies get destroyed. March stood at the door for 3 more seconds. Then he pushed through it and disappeared into the Nevada night, and the sound of a car engine starting and tires on gravel, and then nothing, just wind, just desert, just the vast, empty silence of a landscape that had witnessed everything and would remember none of it. Graves exhaled, long, shaking, the kind of exhale that empties a man completely. Lungs, chest, shoulders dropping, spine curving forward, the physical architecture of vigilance collapsing now that the weight it was supporting had been removed. Tank put a hand on his shoulder. Didn't squeeze, just rested it there. The weight of a 300-pound man's hand, gentle, absolute, present. It's done, Tank said. Not yet, Graves said. He straightened up, looked at Ellie. She was still in the doorway. She hadn't moved the entire time. Her face was dry. Her hands were empty. The box was gone, carried out by the man who'd spent 20 years afraid of what it held. But her eyes held something new. Not relief. Not victory. Something quieter and more permanent. Peace. The specific, hard-won peace of a child who had been carrying an adult's burden and had finally set it down. Let's go home, Graves said. The ride back was different from every ride that had preceded it. The formation was the same. Graves on point, Tank and Deacon flanking, Hollow in the rear, Ash driving the truck with Ellie in the passenger seat. But the energy had changed. The engines sounded different, not softer. Engines don't get softer. But the way the men rode was different, looser. The rigid, combat-ready tension that had locked every spine and tightened every grip for the past 4 days had released, and what replaced it was the particular grace of men who know the fight is over and are letting their bodies remember what it feels like to simply move through the world without bracing for impact. They reached the clubhouse as dawn was breaking. The sky above the desert went from black to deep blue to a thin line of gold along the eastern horizon. The first light caught the chrome of the Harleys in the yard and turned them into a row of burning mirrors. Inside, Lena was awake. She was sitting up in the hospital bed, not fully upright but propped against the pillows, her oxygen cannula in place, her hands folded in her lap. She looked better. Not healthy, that was months or years away if it came at all, but present, anchored. The glassy, medicated distance that had characterized her eyes since the night they moved her was gone, replaced by a clarity that made her look for the first time like a woman who believed she might have a future worth being conscious for. Ellie went straight to her, climbed onto the bed, curled against her mother's side without a word. Lena's arm came around her, thin, trembling, but there, present, holding. Graves stood in the doorway and watched them. He didn't enter the room. Some moments belong only to the people inside them, and this was one. A mother and a daughter, holding each other in a borrowed room in a biker clubhouse at dawn, breathing together. He turned away and walked to the main room. The table was still covered with Ash's papers, coffee cups, and the detritus of 4 days of crisis management. Graves sat down in his chair at the head of the table. His knee clicked. His back ached. His hands were sore. His eyes burned. and he was so tired that his vision kept sliding out of focus. Deacon sat down across from him. For a moment, neither spoke. The dawn light filtered through the high windows, dirty industrial glass that turned the sunrise into a diffused gold haze. 27 years, Deacon said. Graves looked at him. 27 years I've sat at this table, and that's the first time I've ever seen you scared. Graves considered denying it, considered deflecting, considered the 100 ways a man in his position could reframe vulnerability as strategy. Then he let it go, all of it, and told the truth. I was terrified. Deacon nodded. Good. Scared men who admit it make better decisions than brave men who don't. He paused. You did right, Graves. Not perfectly, not cleanly, but right. Couldn't have done it without the vote. Couldn't have gotten the vote without the plan. A ghost of a smile, the first one Graves had seen on Deacon's face in years. Don't let it go to your head. Graves almost laughed. Almost. Over the next 14 days, the world rearranged itself. Vincent Crowe withdrew the eviction against Lena Vale on day 3. On day 5, Millbrook Terrace was listed for sale. On day 9, a nonprofit housing coalition in Reno, one that Rachel Dunn had quietly connected Ash to, signed a purchase agreement. On day 12, Ridgeline Capital filed dissolution papers with the state of Delaware. On day 14, a moving truck was photographed leaving a warehouse office on Reno's east side, and Devlin March, David Kellner, whatever name he carried now, vanished from Nevada as completely as Phantom had vanished 20 years before. Rachel Dunn confirmed the dissolution. Ash verified the property transfer. Deacon personally checked every parole record, every court filing, every database he could access to ensure that no fabricated evidence had been planted against any member of the club. Nothing. Clean. March had kept his word. Whether from fear, from exhaustion, or from the small, devastating thing a 9-year-old girl had said to him in a body shop at 10 o'clock at night, he had dismantled everything and walked away. Graves kept his word too. On day 15, he sat in Rachel Dunn's office and watched her feed one copy of the file through an industrial shredder. On day 16, he drove to Las Vegas with Ash and emptied the bank vault. On day 17, he snapped the USB drive in half over the kitchen sink at the clubhouse and dropped the pieces into a coffee can filled with acetone. It was over, but the ending wasn't a single moment. It was a season, a long, slow process of things falling into place, the way bones knit or engines rebuild, not all at once but piece by piece, with setbacks and adjustments, and the occasional moment of something that, if you weren't careful, might feel like hope. Lena's surgery came 6 weeks later. Graves had found the surgeon through a contact Tank had in Reno's medical community, a thoracic specialist who owed a favor to a nurse who owed a favor to a man whose motorcycle Tank had rebuilt for free 3 years ago. The chain of debts and kindnesses was long, convoluted, and entirely characteristic of the way the Iron Vultures operated, not through official channels, but through the network of human connections that existed beneath the official world, like root systems beneath pavement. The surgery took 4 hours. 12 bikers filled the hospital waiting room, sitting in plastic chairs designed for smaller, less weathered men, drinking vending machine coffee from paper cups, not speaking much. Hollow read his Western novel. Tank stared at the wall. Ash typed on his laptop. Deacon stood by the window watching the parking lot. Graves sat in the corner, alone, his hands folded, his eyes closed. Not sleeping, waiting. The way he'd spent his entire life waiting. For news, for outcomes, for the moment when the thing he'd been fighting for either survived or didn't. At 2:17 p.m., the surgeon came out. She was still in scrubs. Her face was tired but open, the particular openness of a doctor carrying good news. She's stable, the surgeon said. The procedure went well. Recovery will be long. Months of rehabilitation, continued oxygen support, lifestyle modifications. But the obstruction is cleared. Her lung capacity should improve significantly. She's stable. 2 words. Graves heard them, and something inside him, something that had been clenched for days, weeks, years, decades, finally let go. Not dramatically, not with tears or collapse or any of the visible markers of emotional release, just a slow, deep exhalation, a settling. like a building that had been swaying in a storm finally coming to rest on its foundation. Tank cried, openly, silently, tears running down into his beard while his massive shoulders shook. Mace put a hand on his back. Ash closed his laptop and pressed his palms against his eyes. Deacon turned from the window, and his face, that hard, guarded, perpetually calculating face, held an expression that Graves had never seen on it before. Unguarded relief. Hollow closed his book, looked at Graves across the waiting room, nodded once. Ellie wasn't in the waiting room. She was in the hallway outside the operating room, sitting on the floor with her back against the wall, the same posture she'd held in the kitchen the night they first came to Millbrook Terrace. Graves found her there after the surgeon left. He lowered himself to the floor beside her. His knee clicked. His back protested. He sat anyway. "She's okay," he said. Ellie nodded. She already knew. She'd been watching the surgeon's face through the window in the double doors, reading it the way she read everything, with the preternatural attention of a child who had learned to decode adult expressions as a survival skill. They sat together in the hospital hallway for a long time, not talking, just present. The fluorescent lights hummed above them. Nurses passed. Gurneys rattled. The ordinary sounds of a building where people fought to stay alive. "Graves," Ellie said. "Yeah. Thank you." He looked at her. She wasn't looking at him. She was looking at the wall across the hallway, at a point somewhere beyond it, somewhere only she could see. "Your dad thanked me once," Graves said. "Same way, same voice. We just pulled him out of a wreck on Highway 93. Bike was totaled. He had a gash on his head deep enough to see bone. And while I'm trying to stop the bleeding with my shirt, he looks up at me and says, 'Thank you,' like I just passed him the salt." Ellie almost smiled. "He was terrible at asking for help," she said. "The worst. I think I got that from him." Graves looked at her. This 9-year-old girl who had walked 4 miles in a storm, carried a dead man's secret, faced down a room full of bikers, and stood in a doorway while a man who'd spent 20 years destroying lives tried to destroy hers. She was thin, tired, still too old behind the eyes. But there was something else there now, something that hadn't been there in the diner. A looseness, a willingness to occupy the present moment without scanning it for threats. "You got a lot from him," Graves said, "but you don't have to carry it the way he did." She looked at him for the first time, those brown eyes, phantom's eyes. But lighter now, just slightly, the way a sky looks lighter after rain. "I know," she said. Years passed the way years do, not in a straight line, but in circles, spirals, the irregular rhythm of a life being lived rather than survived. Lena recovered slowly. She never regained full lung capacity, but she gained enough to walk without the portable tank, enough to sit on the porch of the small house the club helped her rent near the clubhouse, enough to watch the sun set over the desert while Harleys rumbled in the distance. The club changed too. Not dramatically. The Iron Vultures were too old, too scarred, too set in their ways for dramatic change. But Ellie's presence softened something in the building's molecular structure. Tank taught her how engines worked, carburetors, transmissions, the delicate art of timing a V-twin so it sang instead of stuttered. She was a natural. Her hands were small but precise, and she had Phantom's instinct for machines, the ability to listen to an engine and hear what was wrong the way musicians hear a note slightly flat. Ash helped her with school. Not just homework, the deeper architecture of learning, the frameworks that turn information into understanding. He was patient with her in a way he'd never been patient with anything, and when she brought home her first A on a math test, he pinned it to the clubhouse wall next to the photographs of fallen brothers as if it belonged there. Nobody took it down. Hollow read to her. Every night, when the wind picked up, and the desert turned cold, and the old building creaked like a ship in rough seas, Hollow sat in the hallway outside her room with a worn paperback and read westerns in his quiet, barely there voice until her breathing slowed and the light under her door went out. He never missed a night. Not once. And Graves watched. He watched from the corner booth at Black Line Diner where this had all started. He watched from the head of the table where the club still met, still argued, still held votes that sometimes went his way and sometimes didn't. He watched from the yard of the clubhouse where Ellie, growing taller every month, worked on a motorcycle frame she'd pulled from the salvage pile. Phantom's old frame, they realized one afternoon. recognizing the serial number from a maintenance log that Ash had found in the club's archives. She was rebuilding her father's bike, part by part, piece by piece, not as a memorial, but as a machine. Something that ran, something that moved, something that carried the weight of where it came from while pointing toward where it was going. The bike was finished on Ellie's 13th birthday. She wheeled it into the clubhouse yard at dawn, chrome gleaming, engine rebuilt from the frame up. 14 bikers stood in a semicircle, coffee cups in hand, watching. Lena sat in a chair by the garage door, a blanket across her lap, breathing easily in the cool morning air. Ellie kicked the engine. It caught on the first try, a deep rolling thunder that shook the gravel and sent birds scattering from the roof. The sound echoed across the desert, bounced off the distant mountains, and faded into a sky that was turning gold at the edges. She didn't ride it, not yet. She was 13. But she sat on the seat, her father's seat, and held the handlebars. And for a moment the yard was silent, except for the idling engine and the wind and the sound of men who had survived too much standing together in the early light, watching a girl become something none of them had expected. Not a victim, not a burden, not a debt to be repaid. Family. Graves stood at the edge of the group, coffee in hand, the morning sun catching the silver in his hair and the scars on his knuckles. He looked at Ellie on Phantom's bike. He looked at Lena in her chair. He looked at the men around him, Tank, Ash, Hollow, Deacon, all of them, standing in a half circle like a wall built not to keep people out, but to keep something precious in. He thought about Phantom, about a man who rode into this club carrying nothing and left carrying everything. About a letter written in tight, angular handwriting that said, "Protect what matters." About a choice made in desperation that became, across 15 years and 1,000 miles and the unbridgeable distance between the living and the dead, the most important thing any of them had ever done. He raised his coffee cup, didn't say a word. Tank saw him and raised his, then Ash, then Hollow, then Deacon, then every man in the yard, one by one, coffee cups lifting in the morning light like a toast to something that didn't need a name because everyone there already knew what it was. The engine idled. The desert stretched. The sun climbed higher, and somewhere out on the endless highway that runs from one horizon to the other, through heat and cold and years and loss and the stubborn, unbreakable persistence of people who refuse to let the world win, somewhere out there, a phantom rode alongside his brothers one last time, watching the family he saved carry each other forward into a morning that finally, after everything, felt like it belonged to them.